And today, wonderful day today with wonderful guests from Melbourne, which is Dr. Liz Dean, who is joining us until this afternoon to discuss about decolonizing methods. And I think it's also very important topics to discuss. And here we have our lecturer as well as our students, and also on site here in our room as well as online and the Zoom. I also want to say hello to our participants in the Zoom. You can also introduce yourself perhaps and where you come from in the group chat so that we have, more familiarities of our participants today. And then I think it's a very important topics. Before, I also want to ask: is anyone here has conduct any research with the colonizing method? You can raise your hand. Anyone has conduct any research about using the colonizing method? Yes. Can you tell us a bit about what's your research and what's your name? Sorry, please introduce it. Okay. Okay. Very interesting, yeah, about oils Indonesia in the EU. Okay. Thank you. How do we call Yusril? Yusril. Okay. Anyone else? It's good to have like opening with sharing our experience. I mean, for me myself, I'm doing a research right now about Warige. Warige is Balinese calendar. And it's a very complex combination between lunar, solar, as well as indigenous mathematics calculations of times. And the idea is we are doing this research to decolonize the way we understand about circularities, human nature relationships. So then I feel very much honored to be your moderators today because I have a lot to ask with you to you and discuss with you. So then I would like to introduce Liz. She told me just make it very short. I know because he has a very long, track record and portfolio. But she is actually senior lecturer in sociology in School of Social and Political Science at the University in Melbourne. And now she is continue to explore intersections of social theory, gender, corporeal feminism, anti-colonial theories, and decolonialities with a specific focus upon the ethics of voice and listening. I think you also wrote about a song as narrative. Yeah, that's a very interesting. And also about climate repair and social inequalities. So I think it's also related to Yusril research, yeah, when we discuss about climate repair, social inequalities. So, so I think it's a very honorable to have you here. Welcome, Liz, to our campus. And we are now actually in the middle of final exams. So most of our students are doing exams and the lecturer preparing the exams itself. But we are happy to have you here. And if you are okay to record these meetings, yes. Okay, so now we will conduct our sessions in two sessions. For this morning sessions, we will have sort of like more presentations from this and question and answer. And for the afternoon sessions, we are trying to be more interactive by having your shares or your experience, sharing your experience, and also all your anxieties or whatever you have in mind about decolonialities, we can have that talk in the afternoon sessions. So without further ado, I would like to invite Liz to present your talk. Please, Liz.
Thank you so much, Ivana. Thanks for having me here and inviting me to this beautiful campus. I got lost walking in because it's much bigger than I imagined, but was directed very generously, about 5 people to here. So this talk came from part of a Global Humanities Alliance that I'm part of the Decolonial Knowledge Working Group, and FINA invited me to come. So I thank you first, FINA and Shafu and and Desi for arranging for me to come today. Very, very lovely to be here. And also, I want to acknowledge that in Melbourne, Naarm, what is now called Australia, I work on the lands of the Wurundjeri peoples, the Wallarong, and very much as a settler, benefit from the fact that I work and live and play in that space. And I say that as an introduction to decolonial methods and an introduction because I think as a settler, it's an uneasy space, a necessarily uneasy space for us to work if the us, me, are part of the dominant group that have accrued intergenerational benefits from the extraction, dispersals, the taking of land, the trying to subjugate knowledges and things like that. And it's not a kind of flag waving or virtual signalling worry. I think it's a necessary worry as a white settler. And yeah, which means discussing decoloniality, discussing decolonialism is a really present urgency in the university spaces. And yet, as many First Nations peoples will say, maybe it just needs to be burnt down and start again, like whether or not we can actually, how do we get past colonialism in the present if we're still working with, as Audre Lorde says, and which Linda Tweley-Smith says, you know, if you're still working with the master's tools. So decolonial methods is a really exciting but difficult kind of terrain, as it should be, because constantly having to think through what Tuck and Wang call from the Indigenous spaces in America, that sort of ethics of incommensurability. Maybe we can't all get along and work it out together. At times it has to be quite difficult to confront. And also, and I say this again as a settler positioning up front, it's important to recognise, as Smith invites us to think carefully about when we should step away, when it is not our space to be doing the research in. And particularly, as he points out, when we might work collaboratively, when we could perhaps in positions of power. I'm not that high up the hierarchy despite my years, but getting big grants, maybe you step back from being the lead. Maybe you invite First Nations peoples to take on, and she talks a lot, particularly in all her editions of decolonial methodologies, mentoring and what else we could be thinking about. So it's a tricky space, but a good tricky space. So I am sort of being guided by, or at least giving a reading of parts of the decolonial methodologies, which has research in Indigenous peoples. And Linda Tweley-Smith is from Aotearoa, a Māori academic from a particular iwi, Ngakata Awe, Ngakata Tori, and Turangi, and I apologise for my terrible pronunciation. And this is the cover of just the 2 editions that she has. So it's been a seminal text on decolonial methodologies, and I'm sure, Israel, you might have read it, but lots of people have sort of come to this book to think about practices and what practice can mean. So what he does in the first part of the book as a sort of a seminal text is really get us to start to think about the scientific methodology that emerges from enlightenment and through modernity to get us to really start to think about the production of knowledge, whose knowledge counts as knowledge and what knowledge disseminates around the globe. And so Ramon Grossfugel puts it this way, which I think is a really instructive way, in an article he wrote in 2013, and I quote, "When, how and where did it emerge that men from 5 continents, Britain, Germany, French, Spain and America, produce knowledge that is taught globally?" And so if we think about that question, we immediately start to think, what about all the other knowledges? What about the Balinese calendar? What about, and that reminds me of First Nations Australians calendars that differ around all the different spaces around Australia, where there is very different seasons spoken through. So that Indigenous knowledge at that point, if you like, can be lost because of this kind of privileging of a particular epistemology, which kind of brings in an injustice. So what he says, this is Ramon Grossvogel, and in a sense, Twyla Smith is also talking about this idea, but there's a sort of, from the 15th century on, for epidemicides, genocides, where part of the colonial project, which informs modernity, the idea of enlightenment, starts to get rid of the knowledge that pre-existed, that makes them subjugated. So he said the first one in his reading is the conquest of Andalusia, now Spain, which forced people to convert to Christianity or face death or move. And at the same time, had one of the most extraordinary libraries and collections from around the globe that was burnt. So the knowledge collected was destroyed in order to supplant it with another form of sort of knowing, if you like. The second one is the conquests of Americas, which again, using Akie Mbembe's work on the archive being what also travels with Indigenous knowledges about mountains, about land, about seasons, about calendars, are destroyed. And sometimes destroyed when people are destroyed themselves, but also when they're no longer able to speak and live with the land, which isn't separate. And this is, he argues, when modern racism emerges, the conquests of Africa, which relate to this massive extractive process of kidnapping, enslavement, the transatlantic slave trade, wherein all of their knowledge practices kind of started to be denied and or went with them. So she's working in this context of how knowledge got sort of subverted by this enlightenment. The enlightenment being that animism and other forms of knowledges were seen as pseudo or lesser, inferior, rather than having any value. And so the scientific idea of objectivity and so on had to sort of get rid of the pre-existing knowledges. So women too had to be gotten rid of if they were knowledge holders, and were sort of placed as witches. And they were the people who knew perhaps particular knowledges about plants, about medicinal plants, about healing, about birthing practices. And what's really interesting about this, particularly in the Australian setting, which I know more of, you can see knowledge that women, certain Indigenous women would have had in particular places about medicinal women's business, has now become patented and put into medicines that we buy across the counter in some instances. So it's this really interesting, tragic recreation of the planet. And then Akie Mbembe, the Cameroon philosopher, public intellectual thinker, also talks about, and I'm sort of contextualising in a way where decolonial methodologies arrives out of, this imperialism, which is part of this epistemicide, which is to get rid of and recreate what knowledges could create. And he talks about the idea of discovery as a falsehood, which strove to erase the sovereigns. And this is part of the conflict of colonialism in the present, that sovereigns are still asking for and demanding land in various, very different around the globe, but in various places. So he talks about the various forms of so-called expansion from Iberia to the Dutch, as you well know here, the empires of Europe colonised parts of Southeast Asia, North America, Australasia, South Africa, and from the 1870s and beyond, Africa is carved up and parcelled out. And then we have Russian moving through various regions of Central Asia and Britain through various regions too. And the image behind us is a comic strip where the actual octopus has 12 arms, and it's about the various places that Britain Britain took over. So it's imperialism that she's really interested in talking through after Fanon, Said, where she talks about this process as part of the epistemological recreation, where, following Said and Fanon in some ways, they became constructed a particular idea of authentic knowledge, what's knowable. And it was universalized as something in a sort of more Eurocentric sense, as ways to know and create and produce and govern the generalized other. And that other was always posed and against in order to elevate the ideal of humanity or man constructed as whiteness in this sort of, so everybody else becomes, if you like, an inferior other, with knowledge is not worth knowing. So here we have that idea of empire and coloniality that has a particular rationality. It's really productive in its sets of logics, and it rests on a domination. And it's a domination that separates, Smith asks, and others ask us to think about, a domination over nature, a domination in some instances over man over woman, man over animal. And so it separates things that Indigenous peoples in certain relationality didn't have this or aspire to this sort of logic. It was part of perhaps who and what they were. So it emerges again with this rise of modernity and capitalism, which is part of that extraction processes, which means that you have to dispossess peoples off their land in order to take over, build your universities, make your profits, parcel out land to the white settler. And the sorts of expropriation of land is part of expropriation or the making or enslavement of certain bodies in places like Australia, which we don't always talk about in terms of slavery, the Indigenous worker who was unpaid or paid very little. So we have here too the construction of race, the idea that race is something that is knowable through biological science. And in sociology, as most of you would know, we don't actually hold concept of race. It's often on very dodgy pseudoscience. So the construction of race where you get, Smith talks about a lot, the categorisation, racial classification systems. And you can all probably remember those horrible images of it starts with an ape and moves up to white people, a sort of systems and categorisation of person who's, and it becomes this sort of scientific grounded idea. And this sciences of race that we can know and categorise, the form of social Darwinism, survival of the fittest, starts to legitimate and justify a particular set of governing policies and treatments. Now, of course, this is really specific and determined by who is being colonised and who the coloniser is. And so this really varies within what we might call nation states, but also within Indigenous relationships and empire or colonisation processes and things like that. But the sorts of governing policies in Australia were really grounded in a differential treatment which tried to take away any agency of various Indigenous peoples at particular times under the guise of protectionism, a set of policies which also justified the taking of children. So in this system and these sorts of policy creations, we have lives of value as worthy of being considered as human, and then we have them measured against the others who were as more superior. We have knowledge which is constructed as worth being known, as knowledgeable, as circulating, and we have knowledge which is something we don't even want to think about. And so all of this elevates the colonial settler sort of landscape. How are we going? Am I understandable? Am I doing all right? If you had enough already, do you want me to stop?
Questions so far? Okay.
Thank you.
We take everything for now.
Okay. And if I'm speaking too fast or I'm not, just someone just wave at me because sometimes I can get excited and go a bit quick. So this is an image by Udo J. Kepler from 1902, Puck magazine, I think it was. from Acara, and I put it in here, but we've already kind of established the sort of imperial, the empire logic, but this is the British kind of idea of civilizing their empire. And so you can see, well, what can you see in this image? Does anyone want to say anything? It's a little bit indeterminate on the right-hand side, but immediately we're getting the sorts of sets of dominations or dualism through which a certain epistemologies emerge in modernity, or we might say in modernities, because there's often many. So we get the civilized settler or colonial posed against the barbaric, First Nation savages. That's right. We get the kind of people who on the ground that might be having to look up to the process, learn from, or otherwise die. So we get all those dualisms that are well known here in this image of the empire going out to discover and create the world. So it's within this particular set of logics, epistemology, form of colonisation, if you like, that Smith is really trying to, which he sets up, as I said, in the first half of the book, to get to the idea of decolonial methodologies. So the production of knowledge is part of the idea of a certain rationality, which is elevated, that we can be. I was thinking of Edmund Husserl's work, arguably the father of phenomenology, and him talking about within the Western tradition, bracketing off all that you previously know, look at the world anew, as if that was kind of possible, as if we don't always have a sort of a standpoint or a set of positions from where we are at a certain theoretical understanding, the things that frame our knowledge. So it's really interesting to think about the production of knowledge and what it always leaves out. So as we've already spoken, the creation of inferior knowledge systems, and as if other peoples, particularly Indigenous peoples, peoples from the global south, different peoples, knew nothing worthy of accounting for or recording, or it can just be spoken over. It becomes that subjugated knowledges. So the colonist or the colonisers become the privileged knowers, which is the point here. Language and culture was seen to be located elsewhere. This is a point that Frantz Fanon talks about, that as a Martinican philosopher, psychoanalyst, he was taught to disregard everything from his own space and think that the French, the colonised of Martinique, were the space of authority around knowledge. So rather than being able to look at the knowledges at home. So decolonising knowledge then includes a sort of disruption and interrupting, and I'm quoting Lignoli here, the structures of knowledge that emerge from the experiences of humiliation and marginalisation that continue to be enacted by the implementation of the colonial matrices of power, which we've kind of talked about. And this made me think a little bit about, she's talking about the subaltern, Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak's work when she wrote in 1983 about who becomes authorised to speak, who is allowed to speak. And this relates to who's allowed to be someone who knows things that are worth knowing after Foucault, and who is the one who adjudicates who can know something, who's allowed to be a knower, in other words. And it's who gets to speak for whom. And I think this is one of the spaces that as a settler is a really important thing to think about when we're thinking about decolonial methodologies. As I said before, when is it that we can act in a kind of decolonising solidarity, which is to recognise that we might stand with or stand behind or assist in ways, but not always take the space to be recognised as the knower. I was totally uncomfortable giving this talk and I've almost lost sleep over it for precisely that reason, because I think it is, we can talk about decolonial methodology, but I'm not an authority on Indigenous methodologies. I can read about story work, I can read about what they can do, the importance of them and how they teach, but it's not, we also have to be careful about that listening, responding, and not always what is often called white fragility, kind of demand our space. If we make a mistake, cry about and want to be comforted by First Nations people, that we're okay, you know, that we made these mistakes. I think, yeah, anyway, if that makes sense. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, we'll get to that. Yeah, that's right, this afternoon. So it relates to these questions, which I think is really interesting in terms of, yes, all of our positions and in terms of the role we play or could play in research, but also what spaces we take up when we accidentally take over and take up the spaces that are really not ours to occupy, but in a sense we've got used to being able to occupy the space of speaking, the spaces of knowing. And back to Smith, and this is important to remember too, that while all these things were happening in terms of whose knowledge was circulating, whose was subjugated, whose was no longer known, there were always already active resistance. There was always modes of the reproducing of First Nations knowledges that were circulating through communities that weren't necessarily lost. They may have gone quiet. Smith talks about them waiting, just waiting to be re-emerging. But they've always been known, and that's sort of why I'm interested in narratives of Indigenous First Nations singer-songwriters, but also their collaborators too with settlers, just because of the stories that they capture, even though it's a very popular form. Yeah, about the colonial settler logic and the impacts. So it's interesting to think about knowledge production in relation to the destruction of epistemologies, which we've been speaking with. And a specific example here is Manukau, this mountain in Hawaii. And when I flew into Yogyakarta yesterday, above the clouds was the most beautiful 4 mountain peaks, which I didn't get around to looking up the names of, and I apologise, but you would know these peaks. And it made me think about, I wonder what First Nations knowledges pertain to those mountains. What are the stories that exist with those mountains? Do they still exist? I don't know. Yeah, but that's it. Like the link. Yeah, the stories and things. So these are sacred places of knowledge, but they've also become part of the extraction and dispossession where the benefits flow elsewhere and, of course, contribute to the climate impact. So the sorts of destruction of epistemologies then relates to the disruption of cultural practices as fluid traditions, including, for example, songs, stories, places of knowledge, i.e. the mountain, archival practices. And archival practices don't have to be in our national or our official archives. They can be the practices that are written into landscapes, that are embodied by people who have been dispossessed or maintain them. So, yeah, it's the way in which the struggle for land then becomes central to a decolonisation of knowledge, but also decolonial methodology. Particularly it's World Environment Day today, I learned when I opened up my computer this morning, in relation to climate justice and things like that. So we see a conflict of knowledges that goes on, and this might be called colonisation in the present, in this example in Hawaii, where for many, many years, Hana Trask in particular have been resisting the desire for the University of California to rebuild telescopes that are absolutely enormous. And these are to, I go to the last part here, to progress academic knowledge in our institutions, for scientific progress, to advance knowledge. It's also seen by people in the state as an economic logic, policymakers arguing that there'll be enormous benefits for the community, tourist benefits, but it ignores the sovereign's knowledge and the archive, where they want to protect this land from this 30-metre, 18-storey telescope on the mountain that is part of their knowledge system, part of their spirituality. It would be like building a 30-metre telescope on the Vatican Church or one of your most revered mosques, for example. So it's a very, you know, in a sense, it's not the same, of course, but it is this idea of what counts of knowledge and the sort of competing ideas of knowledge that you see there. Academic progress, if we have this telescope, we'll be able to learn more about the skies. If we have the telescope, we'll make more money for the place. And yet, over whose knowledge did this happen? And Kate Trask has been an extraordinary fighter for Indigenous sovereignty. If I go closer to home, but not very close to me, I must say, but this is up in the northwest of Western Australia, up in what's now called the Dampier Archipelago. It has the largest and some of the oldest petroglyph site in the world. Some of them are back to 60,000 years. And it's currently being given by our Australian government last week, the green light to expand this mine. And yet this site records histories. It is an absolute archive, and you can see, I've been lucky enough to visit, but you can see ships carved into rocks, a little boat, so they would have seen when people were coming 2 years ago. It goes back further. It archives megaflora that doesn't exist anymore there. So they completely date this site, but mining has pushed so much of this site and made roads, and it's undergoing a similar threat to pollution from mining. Okay, so I know that sounds like a really long in, but it sort of establishes, I think it's important to understand what decolonialism is. And it's also, again, important to remind ourselves that it's very specific to particular regions, particular time, depending on the relationships between who was colonised, when and how. So decolonialism can mean different things in different spaces, but it nevertheless has a generalised kind of understanding as you read through the literatures, which is to really create and enact what Fran said, a program of complete disorder, to try and break with these logics that still inform. This is what I mentioned before, with the master's tools. Can the subaltern ever speak with Gatra Spivak when you're still using the same mechanisms to speak? Or who gets to speak for whom, that idea? Indigenous writer and Professor Alexis Wright, one writer, talks about we're always often having to respond to being written about rather than being able to speak for ourselves. And yet we're always speaking, writing knowledges, but it's this difficulty of telling our own stories, but not always having them read or seen. So it's trying to, decolonialism more generally, actively break with the colonial modes that alienate, marginalise and silence people and their experiences. Right. So it's a delinking to begin with recognising the coloniality of knowledge, the sorts of knowledge productions that shape subjectivities, and enact instead liberatory practices, forms of liberation, forms of lifting up by their own emancipatory acts. Indigenous peoples can do this for themselves, I should say, badly. So interrupt colonial knowledges, which I've already made the point of, which is expose what's already there. The Balinese understandings of time, temporality, which is very different, as it is in Australia. Okay, there's no simple, just to finish there, there's no simple reversal from the position. Sometimes this is misunderstood and saying, oh, so the oppressors are just going to become the people in power. No, that's never what decolonial, that's a real misreading. And it kind of is what Tuck and Yang might call a move towards white innocence. So, just to kind of to misunderstand and just sort of elevate yourself to sort of, it's an easy cheap shot, I think, to say, because as Fanon and everybody recognises, a philosopher from Africa, to do this would leave colonial violence and the forms of oppression in place. It would just have different leaders. Yeah. Okay. So far so good. Are we needing to check our phones and we're getting tired already? Are we okay? Yeah, okay. Yeah. Oh, beautiful. I'm just going to spend a couple, maybe 10, 15 minutes at the max here, talking more specifically to decolonial methodologies and what I understand is going on here. So there are various interlocutors that Linda Dwyer-Smith, or Professor Linda Dwyer-Smith, is actually working with, but she's really trying to extend Frantz Fanon's account of historical and forms of colonialism in the present. What are the colonial projects that still exist that might not look the same, but still have these tentacles, with their key agenda of expropriation of land, mind and body. And that's why I just gave those the two examples of Hawaii, Manukau, and the land of the First Nations peoples up, where the petroglyphs, just forgotten the name of that country. So it looks at the problems of academic research as part of this knowledge production. Because Fanon made the very big point, writing in the 60s, that objectivity is always directed against those who are research, particularly as First Nations peoples or those who are colonised. And it's the way in which various transnationally, and again, not to conflate all the differences, Indigenous peoples have been over-researched, made object and subjects of research. And this is a very central point, which we can speak about more this afternoon. So in page 4 of, I can't count, 12 of the new introduction of the 3rd edition, the 2021, there's a preface to Smith's book, Decolonising Methodologies, where she says, and I quote, "The challenge for researchers of decolonising methodologies as a set of knowledge-related critical practices is to simultaneously work with colonial and Indigenous concepts of knowledge in decentering one while centering the other." Yeah, so she said, this is no easy task. This is something that we should worry through and work at all the time when we're doing research, and how to both disrupt and decolonise research practices, and what might that mean, but also bring forward Indigenous epistemological processes, approaches, philosophies and methodologies. And it's really interesting, and this is where it gets tricky for white settlers, or those of us that are in the dominant position, to work out, to not appropriate Indigenous epistemological processes, but learn from them, and also not become ventriloquists to think that we can keep speaking for and about as if it's our knowledge. So decolonising methodologies, of course, is to move beyond this scientific data collection, which is informed by a set of biases implicit in research. And this comes from Smith's work, particularly from modernity, which we've already set up. So she also argues that theories, concepts, ideas can frame and then create and ask the wrong question. So kind of think of ourselves as knowers who can just go into research fields and start doing research without establishing relations, without the First Nations peoples or peoples who are marginalised in thought, then we can start to reassert ourselves as knowers or as saviours. So it's how do we kind of decolonising our frames of thought, which are often informed by what's called by Nick Dodson, writing in 1994 in Australia, an Indigenous leader, a deficit model, that there's a problem that white people can fix, that Indigenous people are the problem, rather than sort of looking at a strength-based model, which is actually, if we speak with First Nations people, they probably can articulate what they need. And they, and if we bother to build relationships with them, they will identify the sorts of questions that they require answering. So it just that they've resisted and survived for so long, they know a lot about what white people do and are, because their mere survival has required that. So in that sense, they can identify what sort of problems that might exist. So the researching the problem to be fixed from the perspective of governments, Smith talks about NGOs, researchers' knowledge base without speaking with communities first comes with a set of biases. And then once again, we become these knowers and or saviours. We will save you by finding the answer without perhaps finding out what is the best question to be asking. So if, again, we're talking about decolonising methodologies, then all researchers must start to ask these questions, which are in her book. Whose research is it? Who's it going to own the data? And there's been a big shift. Transnational Indigenous peoples have done. I know Maggie Walter, a Palawa woman, Tasmania, has talked a lot about sovereign data, data sovereignty. So whose data, who gets to own it? And talks a lot about genetic testing, the taking of tissue to make medicines, or then the bodies of First Nations peoples at different times have been experimented on. It's happened in various places around the world. So whose interest does the research serve? Is it actually to get promotion? Is it actually to elevate my position, to take the space of and get my career moving, which is always on a very exactly. So who's being researched for what reason? And then the question, so whose interest does this serve, but who benefits from the research collected? Is it going to benefit the communities being researched, or the question that's being researched? Is it going to have a beneficial outcome? And this is really strong in Tuck's work, Tuck and Yang's work, but Tuck's work, but also a lot of First Nations researchers who are saying, you know, Twyla Smith says, I don't want to even call at research sometimes. She says, I want to think about it as projects that matter and projects that will have real outcomes for the people that I'm working with. And that's what they're most proud of, they talk about often. So who benefits from the research collected, and how are the questions designed? Who are they designed with? Are they co-produced? And designed with whom? Who's the collaboration? What are the relationships that have been built to create this co-designed set of questions, which can really serve the community that helps answer the question before? And how will the results be disseminated? To whom? So she also talks about, in her context in Aotearoa, with the Māori peoples that she works with, a system of sort of reporting back, which can't necessarily be, here I'm going to send you the government report. Here I'm just disposing what I found, you know, do what you want. She's saying, no, sit with people. And it might take, and it might be an ongoing process of delivering what's going on or what's being found. And who can do the research? Again, this becomes the question about who should actually be inhabiting these spaces. Is there a way of assisting First Nations peoples, for example, or marginalised communities to become the researchers in their own spaces? And the other thing, and it's again goes back to the question of who benefits from research collected, is research must create measures which reveal counter stories. So your work is revealing a counter story about temporality in the calendar in Bali. Like these are the stories that often pre-exist. They've just not been known in our sorts of spaces for a while. Yeah, so think about whose work we are using, the we being the so-called dominant groups, perhaps. Engage with First Peoples methods and knowledges without appropriation and acts of ventriloquism, which I've spoken about before. Or if we're always speaking about others, then it becomes part of that sort of a collapsing of white supremacy with a white innocence. And white supremacy here not meaning kind of the Ku Klux Klan, men that run around dressing in white uniforms, but a form of kind of idea that once again we are on the top of the space of knowing. And as Twyla Smith talked about, It's not the work of settlers that we can always do. And I'm thinking particular from the colonial settler Indigenous space of Australia. And there's probably differs around the world. So how do you become a decolonial ally? I think an important question for some of us to think about in a different way to do this decolonial methodology. So you can absolutely do the work, but also do it in terms of relations and be really careful about how you proceed. And if it is your space to be working in. So, or do you become a support act? Can, in Tyler Smith's work, a Maori person do this? And I've left the little accent off the O, actually. And can we change the power relationships in order to do this? So she talks about decolonial methodologies in relation to how we can build relationships over time with the communities that become part of our research. And this takes time. And it must, as I've already posed, include local Indigenous communities who can be expert actors, who are already practicing care for country, land and place, but often with land expropriation, competing interests over land, whether it's a telescope in Hawaii or whether it's mine extraction in northwest Western Australia. It's a competing. How can you practice culture when your land's being bulldozed and turned into iron ore? And the other important point that she talks about is the way in which, and I can't understand this as a white settler, but there's a living with a relational world where the human, not really, the human inanimate is not really separated, but it has a different way of thinking. And I just put that to remind myself, but on page 113 in third edition, she has 12 ways of being researched. So we can think about that this afternoon. And I'm going to finish up with just a couple of things to say about counter narratives then. So this is a memorial in Naarm in Melbourne that was erected in 2016. So the process has taken a long time, but two First Nations people who were hung by the state for being resistant fighters of the war. Now that story was known, but it took a long time to become that counter narrative to actually become something that we could honour in Australia, because it's taking a long time for truth, well, the Makarrata Treaty, truth voice, to kind of become part of our lexicon. We don't have an official treaty, although treaties were signed in different places, the John Brown Treaty, but not like the Waitangi Treaty, is a smaller thing. But so we get the colonial war as a narrative that is starting to be remembered or memorialised in Australia. Our war memorial, our official war memorial in Canberra, had nothing of resistance fighters within Australian First Nations communities. And the myth was always that they were passive. And yet there's resistances that I had to take out a lot of slides. So I'm going to conclude here with lawyer, academic Irene Watson, Indigenous thinker extraordinaire. And she says, when thinking how to engage with Aboriginal sovereignties, Australian society becomes stuck where the ground of impossibility lies. But it is this ground exactly where our thinking should begin. Thanks.
Very interesting. Thank you. Thinking. We start with impossibilities then.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Somewhat. Okay, thank you, Liz. I think it's been very stimulating presentations from you. Not only we discussing how to do decolonizing research in practice, but I like the way you discussed before to what extent we have already been, doing this discourse on decolonizations. I think and now we open to question and answer for those of you who have questions, or not only questions. I think we also open to comments, or you want to share your own experience or your own anxieties and concern about conducting research, feel free to do so. But perhaps for me, I have just one to open up our discussions. I know that is like, let's go back further first from the beginning. There's the way how would you define decolonialisms? Because there's also neocolonialism, post-colonialism, and decolonialism. So how would you differentiate these three, terms?
Yeah, it's really tricky, and I'm kind of reluctant to do it, but I'll do it because there's a lot of conflation. Yeah,
Yes.
so I'm stepping on, lines for saying this, but the marked difference of decoloniality is precisely that desire for disruption. It's saying we can't keep doing the same thing. So Frantz Fanon talked about in a kind, what he called in a post-colonial landscape, flag independence. And he says we might become post-colonial states. We might no longer be controlled by the Dutch or the Japanese or the British, but just changing the flag doesn't disrupt the structures and the systemic racism and the forms of language and consciousness that percolates through to today, that we're only just starting to reconsider. And this is when I say we, I'm talking about politics, I'm talking about legislators, policymakers, terribly badly and terribly overdue the idea that Indigenous sovereignty exists in, for example, Australia. In some countries, there's so many layers of colonisation that we often don't get to the domination of the nation state colonising present. Yeah, so there's just so many layers of where. So I think the major point is that disruption, is that delinking, is that kind of break. And of course, it's really difficult to do, isn't it? Because we're in universities.
Yes.
And I teach Karl Marx. I love him. I teach Baron Durkheim. I love those three old boys. But and they've got a lot to offer. But I also try to teach it through the critical prisms that have come afterwards, the feminist interventions, the fact that William W.E. Du Bois was a Black American scholar who couldn't really even get a proper academic job, writing at the same time as those three white wise men. So it doesn't mean necessarily you have to throw out all forms of knowledge, but I think that's not what's being said around decoloniality. It's recognising those accesses of power, that sort of rationality and logic, which kind of refuses another way of being, another way of knowing, another way of living. So it's a real, let's disrupt. Yeah. So that to me is what decoloniality can do. But as I reassert, it is a question of what decoloniality means in relation to who is the coloniser and who was colonised we. And of course, when we think about the movement of modernity, some people like to call modernities around the world as a kind of an enlightenment that got rid of animism and saw it as kind of ridiculous belief systems and irrational and sort of privileged their rational thought. I don't know where I was going with that. It was going to be a really profound statement. But okay. Well, I was going somewhere with it. It's taken this many years, and I think it's hard to kind of rethink certain forms of Indigenous sovereignty when I don't have the connection, and I'm quoting here, from Watson and Morton Robertson to First Nations scholars in Australia, connecting to all living things, place, kin, stories, land and law. I mean, this is not my experience. So how do we do this work within the academy, with the academy, but also to be part of that breaking? Yeah, okay. It's not really answering your question, but it goes somewhere.
Yeah, but that's reminding me of my conversations with one of my Indian colleagues, but it's part of a joke, but it's like a reflective joke. Well, she told me that, well, for me, neocolonialism is for Indian scholars to study about our history in the UK or British Museum. That's neocolonialism. Post-colonialism is for us Indians to demand the British Museum return the artifact of Indian to our countries. And decolonialism is to burn the museum. Yeah, that's part of the disruptions. Yeah, disruptions, the linking.
So it's fantastic, and it brings to mind, so we had
Yeah.
Martin Langton, who's an professor at the University of Melbourne, Indigenous scholar, and two historians, settlers, write a book around truth last year to expose all the sorts of colonial practices that the University of Melbourne sits with. The naming of buildings, who were eugenicists, who were, and it's real, the funding of the philanthropists in their role in what's called land dispersals, which means getting First Nations peoples off land so you can grow cattle, which means probably murder. And so these are the sorts of histories that are coming through. But yes, but decoloniality or decolonialism would kind of make the case again, as you say, burn it all down, but also that's great to know the truth, but where is the repair work? What repair? Who might we be paying the rent to? The Wurundjeri land? Who might we pay the rent to in terms of the materials the universities built it out of, the lands that the materials come from? And it's not just repair, it's also the repatriation of things that have been taken to have these brilliant colonial museums around the globe. So yeah, what is the repair work? Treaty, and that's something that's been Indigenous peoples are working through at the moment in each state, just started to work through. Yeah. But at the same time, we took to the greater Australian population, as whether or not First Nations peoples could advise government on policies that impact them specifically, and it failed. So we're not that far along, certainly nowhere near decolonisation. Yeah.
Okay. Now, thank you, Liz. Now I open questions or sharing from our participants here. Feel free if you want to share some things. Also, our participants in Zoom, you also invited to share your questions or your comments or reflections to Liz. Who wants to? Yes.
Hello.
Questions here. The first one is, previously on the slide, you mentioned about how sometimes we focus on studying Indigenous people as the object. And I'm a little bit confused on that. If we want to apply decolonizing methods, should we study colonizers instead of the Indigenous people? Like, for example, when I want to know more about the struggles of the Indigenous people in Australia, should I study it from the perspective of the colonizer, of why do they came to Australia, what they have done, etc. The second question is, when again we would like to apply decolonizing methods, we need to ask whose work we are using. But for researchers, like those who just started their research journey, students, for example, we do not have the access to interact or communicate with the Indigenous people. So we mostly use the sources from the internet, data, government archives. What's the solution for this, to make sure that the media and reading that we use are those who support the colonizing movement? Thank you.
Thanks. Great question. Really two questions. Would you like to respond?
We should start thinking with what you're saying. They're really good questions, and I don't know that I'm authorised to answer them completely either. However, it's the way in which Fanon talks about the objects of knowledge, Indigenous people being over-researched and over-researched. I mean, I think sometimes, again and again on the same sorts of questions, you could probably go through the archives and find answers to your question there without going to a community and asking the same question again. but it's what Indigenous peoples have been subjected to in that process of becoming the object of the colonial gaze, or the object of the researcher's gaze, without that kind of communicative force that's really been disrupted by, or at least attempted to be disrupted by, decolonising methodologies. And again, Smith's book talks a lot about the different forms of ethics. We have forms of ethics to ensure that we're not asking the wrong questions, that so-called our research isn't going to impact First Nations peoples. And yet, although this is slowly changing in Australia, but the research questions are, the ethics programs also have an ethical problem within them, which is, in Australia at least, it makes every Indigenous person vulnerable. It makes every Indigenous person passive, as if they are not agents, active thinking subjects who are able to engage with other people. So in order to protect Indigenous people from some of the terrible objectification, some of the terrible research, taking tissue and using it for medicines and treating Indigenous peoples as objects as a great population that's got diabetes, for example. Gee, this would be a good sample to understand, which is what Autogen, the genetic company, tried to do with the Tongan community, refused it years ago. So yeah, there's always these sorts of dilemmas of what are the objectification processes and how we can disrupt that. But I think it goes back to the question about who should be doing the research. So but to your second question about the legitimacy of what you're reading and doing, I think that's a really good question too, especially with Dr. Google, especially with blooming AI-generated data coming at it. It drives me nuts. Anything I put in, I get a realm of things. I'm always having to go down underneath. And yet, it didn't prevent the capacity to sort of be thinking through this problematic. That's exactly the problematic of decolonising methodologies, what you should be thinking through and whose work you should be reading. Look, I'm no expert here, and I'm kind of a bit surprised that I'm doing a thing on decolonial methods, to be honest. I'll just say that.
That's interesting. You might want to share what makes you
Oh,
do this.
well,
Yeah.
well, it came about kind of almost accidentally, because I don't do research as in this sort of research, and yet I do narrative research. And so I find that as a sort of place of thinking about counter narratives and things like that. But I'm looking at what's already written in song as potentially the stories that First Nations peoples tell about themselves that have been written by Indigenous people, sometimes with settlers. So there's ways of sort of trying to work out where you can position yourself in what you read, but I read enormously. I always try and read, I mean, and this sounds like virtue signaling again, but I read an enormous amount of Indigenous researchers, Indigenous authors. There is a plethora out there. And so why I did decolonial methodologies, and this is not a plug, but I've created a decolonial First Nations thinkers and practices and thinkers from the Global South website, an online site that's free, open access now, which has over 600 thinkers in it. And each yeah, thinkers of the Global South.
Thinker of the Global South. The website.
It's in that link if you, yeah. And what I tried to do with that was recognise that if we're talking about decoloniality or repair, then I was thinking about what is in our own subjects to teach. What are we teaching? Who are the authors? Are they from the Global South? Are they Indigenous authors? What else? So that doesn't really answer your question, but it sort of goes some way toward it. But they're really good questions, and to be asking that is fantastic.
Okay, we have one question in Zoom asking
Hi, Astina. I just want to say hello to you. If you want to, unmute yourself and tell your questions yourself, that would be great.
Oh,
Hi. Oh, Sorry, it's pretty late here, and I don't want to turn on my video because I'm not videoable right now. I don't look videoable right now.
It's okay.
Yeah, so I'm from Department of Politics and Government, and right now I'm doing PhD in University of Illinois, and I'm really new to this methodology, and I found it really fascinating, and it made me think about Puerto Rico, since I've been living in the U.S. for the past 4 years, and I found Puerto Rico is a very interesting place. Like, it's currently colonized, I would say. It's currently colonized by the United States, and I've been trying to find how. I've been having a hard time understanding who are the Puerto Rican, and listening to this presentation, I was like, it's a really good method, although Puerto Rico is not my dissertation, but it's just like a side thoughts that I always had during my coursework. And my question is, just in general, I was wondering how to apply decolonizing methods in currently colonized nations, especially when these nations have been colonized long enough. I mean, Puerto Ricans speak Spanish. I feel like that's their form of like fighting against the colonizer, which is the federal government of the United States. And the problem is the current Puerto Ricans right now, I don't think I will consider them as indigenous. And although when I ask Puerto Ricans, they're able to ask like who are, I don't know how to say, like the indigenous of the Puerto Ricans, and it is contested. The current Puerto Rican people always argue that at least there's a little percentage of their genes coming from the indigenous people, which make me really bad right now because I forgot who they are. But basically, I'm interested to know, like, is it possible to apply decolonizing methods in a currently colonized nation who are almost completely changing, and to the point that I feel like Puerto Rico is almost completely Americanized, to the point that I don't really see how to identify who the real Puerto Ricans are, if that makes sense. Thank you.
Thanks for your question, and I feel completely out of depth here. Oh, you need me to have the phone.
Yes,
I thought it was
yes,
too
yes,
close.
yes.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, got you. Yeah, I don't know the Puerto Rican landscape. I think that's a question that I would be looking to see who are your First Nations or Indigenous authors who speaking about the position of their indigeneity. I understand what you're saying, and I mean, we in Australia lives in a colonial present too, and yet there's clearly, you're saying it's not as clear who might be First Nations. I think maybe that's something to have a really good think through the literatures of Puerto Rican, who are the authors, who's been doing studies there. But yeah, I don't know that I can answer that question. But I get the feeling that in most nation states, there's First Nations peoples somewhere. Even if the identification and the categories, I mean, you've heard me slipping. In Australia, we say First Nations, but people also like and prefer Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander. Some people prefer First Peoples. Like, there's lots of different ways of identifying. But if you know the particularity, a lot of First Nations peoples in Australia prefer to be talked about as from their country, like Gomeroi or Wanji, or which is a location. But so yeah, sorry, I can't answer that question. Thanks.
Thanks, Ina. I think this is not only about like question and answer, yeah, but it is also about sharing our, concern, sharing our frustrations. I also share your frustrations in how to do research, decolonizing research in a country where we still feel like we are being colonized. I also understand the challenge is not only on epistemological challenge, but also on practice. Like, for example, how do we find these people? How do we get access to, to be in contact with them. And sometimes it could be risky. For example, if we talk to indigenous people or whatever they want to be named, sometimes it can be a security risk as well for the researchers. For example, if we have to discuss or have, contact with these marginalized people with marginalized knowledge. So thank you again for sharing. I know it's very late for you, but feel free to share other concerns, other, stories from your sides there, and also for our other participants in Zoom. And yes.
And I might just add there too, just made me think of this, but it might be that the First Nations people of Puerto Rico don't want to be researched.
Yes.
There are communities that don't require that sort of intervention necessarily. I mean, again, it's really specific to the particular context, and so lots of layers and lots of necessary complexities and contestations.
Thank you. Okay. Yes.
Okay, thank you for the insightful perspective, Liz. And thank you for the opportunity. Actually, I tried to study about the decolonization in the production knowledge, and this is very insightful lecture I get from you today. And I have an anxiety that I cannot break it down. Maybe I want you to help me. And this is the question about the yeah, maybe. Okay, this is about the positionality of research. So sometimes as a researcher, we are extracting data to some degree to understand and to I don't know how to say it, to get more knowledge about something. And as a researcher, maybe I am an Indonesian, so I try to study about Indonesian and culture of Indonesia, and we are not from a settler colonial. So how we position ourselves as a researcher and how to locate this research on the politic of knowledge production. I mean, it's very complicated for me, and I want to know what do you think about it, and maybe I want to ask an example how to do it in the research practice. Thank you.
Well, I'm turning the question over to your partner here, just beside.
Okay.
No, I'm interested to know because, of course, I'm an outsider to your space, and so, and I'm talking very much, and that's what I mean about the specificity of who is the colonizer, who is the colonized, what decolonialisation might mean as a method in each could be quite different. I think the questions remain. But so what's your approach to your positionality and within the sort of Indonesian landscape? I think that's unfair, but I just figure that's, yeah.
Boleh.
I think it's quite complicated question, and it's hurt to me. Okay, maybe I should give you some context about my research. It's about how the EU tried to securitize palm oil by saying that palm oil is a threat for nature, but I'm not trying to say that what you say it's not true or not based on facts, but I'm just trying to look at the power dynamics between between actors that involved in this issue, because I'm international relations student, so I'm not talking about the indigenous people or something, but I'm more looking into the how the dominant or more powerful actors like EU try to utilize the discourse or dominant discourse, or we can say a dominant system of knowledge to pursue their interests by you know, when they say that palm oil is a threat, they use some kind of research, but it's based on the knowledge that is so Eurocentric. So yeah, maybe that's what I can say about my research, because it's not done yet, so I cannot talk too much about it.
Oh, right. And I wonder about your positioning of yourself within the research, like, where are you located in that research? And this goes back to old feminists sort of understand, not old, I shouldn't say that, you know, the 70s feminists, indigenous, and then there were Black feminist theorists like Patricia Hill Collins talking about the standpoint. And again, that's it's an essentialist position. That's the critique of standpoint theory sometimes, that it gets too enclosed. But yeah, I wonder, what's your location?
I don't know. I think actually I've never thought about it before, but I'm trying to look this problem from the perspective of neocolonialism.
Yeah.
Because I believe that European Union use their position to look for some economic gains from this problem. So yeah, actually, I don't know to answer how to position myself in this research, because I never thought about it before. But thank you for the.
No, it's a great. Do you want to speak to indigenous? Sorry, the position Indonesia.
Yeah.
I feel like you would have more.
Yeah, I'm also from international relations background, but perhaps I think I come to the point now, I think at the moment, that I also realized the way I learned about IR in the beginning was very much colonized knowledge, to be honest. Like, for example, the history we learn in IR is the history of World War I and World War II. And now, after 20 years of learning it, then maybe it's too late, but then it comes to my question is that why I need to learn about World War I and World War II, and where is Indonesia in that histories? Where is our position in that histories? And I think that is also one of big motivation from us in the department to discuss about Bandung conference, for example, because that is very much at least among, and I also believe that we have a lot of more contributions which still need to be rediscovered beside Bandung conference. And that is also why I come to, my research about Wariga, for example. Even though my own self-critic always asks me, so where is the IR in research about Balinese calendar, for example? But I think on positionalities is that it gave a lot. We need to have a lot of question. What do we mean by colonial logic, for example? Colonial logic for me is not only about the foreigners who came to Indonesia, like the Dutch or the Japanese, came during the colonial period, but also it's about, am I still having this colonial logic? Because maybe this is something, as what you mentioned before, that we still have this bias, we still have this somewhat standing positions, from our upbringing or from the way we learn in our formal education systems. And for me, doing decolonial research is much more about how to deconstruct my own understanding, my previous understanding. And it takes a lot of, it's very scary, to be honest, because there is a lot of shadow of the future that maybe my research doesn't count as knowledge, as formal knowledge, doesn't count for, career or other things. That's kind of positionalities. But then for me, why I'm doing Wariga, I think my positionality is I feel confident if I do research about my background, where I came from. So I was born in Bali and raised in Bali for 70 years. And then it's always makes me think that after living Bali for more than 20 years, it came to my awareness that I don't know much about my hometown. Like, for example, the calendar that I live with, is that just a calendar that used to be in my home, but I don't really know. I don't know whether you have seen the Balinese calendar. It's like a lot of text, thousands of text there. And even I remember during my childhood, there is like this, what's it called? A symbol in circle. And then I asked, oh, how can I read that? Because it's like written in Sanskrit. And then one of my teachers said, "Oh, no ordinary people can read the calendar, because if you read it, you will be crazy, because it will take a lot of, there's only privileged people who can read it." And now I came into that memory, and then I was like asking, why only some people who can have access to this knowledge? And then, yeah, that sort of like positionality, I think, for me, what makes me more confidence in conducting research is when I do research about my own, locations, my own positionalities. And I think, yeah, that is something I share, but maybe other colleagues have more, experience as well.
Yeah, fantastic. And it actually makes me come back to your question too, when you were asking about where do we locate ourselves in knowledge?
Yeah.
And what is it that we, and I think that's Professor Gary Foley, who's also a First Nations scholar at Victorian University in Melbourne, he used to talk about educate yourself and you can educate others, when he's talking about what it is that you can learn about sort of First Nations histories, if you like. And it takes me to your point, like the idea that that's a sort of form of knowledge that perhaps not lost, but just waiting to be, taken, waiting to be re-seen or re-heard. And it's as legitimate as any other form of knowledge. But when we've had this sort of modernist perspective about epistemologies, it gets, placed in a dualism. Precisely breaking with that, I think. But yeah, so I'm not answering your question.
But I have a question, actually. I don't know in Melbourne or in Australia, to what extent this research about decolonization is somewhat, safe for academic fields. Because I remember that few years ago, right before 2023, there are a growing number of decolonial research group or decolonial reading group in the Netherlands where I did my PhD, etc. But I didn't hear that anymore after the 7th October 2023. And then when we start talking about Gaza and try to connect with decolonization, it seems very disappeared because it doesn't want to be very political in a sense. So I noticed the way I understand now, studying decolonization is very political. But then I don't know whether this is something also happens in Melbourne. It's a way to, still consistent doing decolonization research.
Look, one of the reasons why I built that site was that I was really, and I'm going to dish some of my colleagues here, but I was really frustrated with the curriculum of some of my colleagues. The whiteness of the curriculum, the maleness of the curriculum, and the sameness of the curriculum. And it's not like we can't let decolonizing be a fashion again. And it's not like it's new. It's been around since the 50s, and for long longer than that. But in terms of Wathongi's work from from Africa. I mean, there's been a lot of people talking about a decolonisation, and it might have shifted in its intent and its engagements with various thought, but it can't be a metaphor that Tuck and Yang talk about. It really can't be. And yet it is, as they talk about, two ethics of incommensurability. It's going to be uncomfortable. It's hard to find the place to speak these two things at once and find your place within it. But I think First Nations peoples in Australia often talk about the white sort of hand wringing, the white fragility, tell us how to do it. And it's like, well, no, find your place. Just keep kind of educating yourself and find your place. And you might make mistakes, and it might not always be relevant in the way that I'm speaking about the settler client space. And yet I feel like another layer, and I'm going to go out on a limb here, and perhaps I should just stop right now and not say it, but I feel like another layer of Indonesian history is probably First Nations peoples.
Yes.
Those people that would have had some stories about those mountains that I saw popping out of the cloud. There would have been. I sort of know vaguely that there is, but what were their knowledges? What are their knowledges? What do they help us think about in relation to climate change, in relation to climate justice, in relation, and that was, it's really, I know you've just had floods and fires, but we're all having mad fires now with their own weather systems in the time of the so-called Anthropocene. When we had a huge fire in Australia, we suddenly started to talk about, again, First Nations fire practices, because they have lots of, I don't know enough about it really, but lots of words for fire. They do cool fires, they do hot fires for different sort of things, some to get animals, but some to renew the grass, but some to burn off the things that will create the major fires. But as soon as we got past that major fire, that sort of conversation between the two knowledges disappeared, and it went back to the same old practices. We go in and do burning of bush and whatever. Yeah. So.
Yes.
Yes. Hello, everybody. My name is Mariam Jamila, and I'm currently studying in the Department of Politics and Government, and focus in natural resources governance. So, about that research on indigenous communities, particularly the role of NGO in this context. I find this very interesting because I had an opportunity to observe a panel discussion involving NGOs around the world at the moment that are concerned with the indigenous rights and climate change, and also energy transitions, because it is the issues that are rising, emerging in my field at the moment, or in other field also, and how it's highly intersecting with the anthropocene, and the impacts of indigenous people in this case is very damaging in my opinion. So the interesting is that the FPIC part, when we talk about indigenous people, we see how FPIC, or free informed prior consent, is highly important of its existence in development projects initiated by the national or the regional government. The thing is, while I observed that panel discussion, is the Indonesian NGO, for example, the NGOs from Indonesia, translated FPIC differently from the global norm or global standard, as I see that this is global norms, and it's also connected with the broader issue of knowledge management, as you said priorly. And I like to know your thought about this, because if the FPIC is translated differently, there are the vulnerability of dilution to a global consensus that can be deliberately make the indigenous community exclusion excluded, excluded, or marginalized in this discourse as a whole. I think that it could be intentionally or unintentionally staged to justify ignoring the rights of indigenous people in the development projects. And I think that such practice could undermine the genuine participations and threaten the indigenous sovereignty and well-being in our democracy these days. So I would like to know your thoughts about this, or do you think it is beneficial to adapt or translate FPIC in different contexts? As I know that nothing is really one one policy can fit all sizes of it. Yeah, I think that's my question. Thank you.
People officially, and that's why in kind of a formal forum with the NGO, with the government, like Ministry of Foreign Affairs especially, don't recognize indigenous people. What we recognize legally is masyarakat adat or customary communities. So in that sense, I think that creates complexity, when we discuss about what we mean by indigenous people in the global discourse, but then we bring it to a formal forum which don't recognize indigenous people word. Yeah. Then
So can I ask, what's a customary community? If it's not an indigenous community, what is a customary? Like that would seem to me like cultural specificities, particular language groups with particular practices.
yeah. Yeah, they have their own traditions, their local practice.
Indonesia is currently still in the battle of legislation, right? For the MAH, Masyarakat Hukum Adat, or the Customary Law Society. Just sometimes it baffled me that we Indonesia are the most heterogeneous people with a lot of tribes, with a lot of cultural richness, but we are so behind in that in recognizing the rights of the nations that comes before us. That's why I think it's just the lingo that's supposed to be commonalized, I think, because indigenous rights is a global issues. We believe that. And the climate change, land grabbing, land appropriation is all the threats to that community. And as an academic of decolonializing methods, what do you think about this?
In question. No, I think you did a really good job of it. I think, didn't she? In posing the question, you were already problematizing it and sort of saying this is a problem because the dilutions could mean less consent and couldn't mean less engagement. And again, I know this is a terrible default position of mine, but I'm not expertise on any of this area that you're talking about. But I think if we're thinking about what Twyla Smith asked us to think about in relation to decolonising methodologies, yes, you've identified problems of consent. You've identified problems of who's it for, how's it being done, who's being spoken with, what are the sets of questions, what are the outcomes? Are we going in as saviours who already know what the problem is, or are we asking the communities? What are the problems that are required to be identified? So, which is, shorthand for some of what can be decolonial in terms of methodologies. I think you've answered your question, and it brought to mind a kind of tragic but an incredible case in Australia where, Izzy Mosby from Zenith Kess Massac Island in the Torres Strait, right up the top of Australia, that little funny bit up the top there, was part of the Torres Strait 8, what's called the T8, and they took the Australian government to court, at the United Nations Court, for contributing to the rising sea levels in their country, in their island, basically, because they said your continuous allowance of mining and extraction is, we've got 5 mines since the left government came in, which is right nevertheless, but is contributing to us not being able to practice culture, not being able to sustain our lives. Meaning, and he gave examples like, our ancestors are always with us, but we have to go out with, this is terrible really, but we have to go out with buckets every morning after a big sea storm, a big surge, and pick up the bones of our ancestors because they're being washed away because of Australia's contribution to climate change and emissions. And they contribute 0 point something % on the island. So yeah, they're not, so the Australian government's complicit. So they won the court case. And they're meant to be helping to do repair work around the island and giving money, but they've pretty much been told that they will have to leave that island, like some of the east coast, I believe, or the west coast of Java, that those villages will, that they probably won't have anywhere to live in the future. So, yeah, just as an example, yeah.
Just keep that part of
Yeah.
problematization
Yeah.
as the end.
Yeah.
Research.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes.
Maybe I just to share my anxiety that I just realized after hearing some discussion from this forum.
We don't want to make
Uh,
you anxious.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think it's quite helpful. As Smith in your PowerPoint before that, research must create measures to reveal counter stories. But once again, this is about positionality. About my research, I really don't know how to act or to position myself in this research because I don't know. Should I be in favor with Indonesia about this policy? Because Indonesia said that European policy like UDR, REDs, it's discriminative. But once again, when we say about, it's different when we say about nation or when we are talking about nation or indigenous people, because when we talk about indigenous people as a marginalized actor, I think we can say that it's true. But when we said that nation as a marginalized, I think it's debatable, right? Because when we talk about the climate change, for example, or something about mining activities or palm oil, I believe that sometimes nation Indonesia as a marginalized actors, as a global south actors, maybe you can say that they don't know what is the best for themselves because they need to create economic benefit, and sometimes it prevents them to see what they really need to act or to fight against this climate change. So I don't really know, should I like support Indonesia in this kind of issue, or yeah, maybe you have a opinion about this.
So, yeah, my position there is to be rigorously, thinking about what First Nations peoples are telling us and thinking about what the government's doing and trying to just weave that together as a response. Yeah. So I don't sweat it. But you might, I mean, I'm speaking naively.
No, I also agree with you. I think we have a bit of anxiety is good.
Yeah.
Just to make us aware, is there something we are missing? Are we,
Yeah.
Sometimes feel too confident, then we forget something else. But then, of course, having too much anxiety also not helpful.
And we all frame everything we say.
Yeah.
I can't tell you how long it took me to put together that little talk there and how much I threw out and my nervousness. And I think it's it's right. What is my I'm not entirely sure that I should be here talking about decolonising methodologies, and I really don't want to talk about Indigenous methodologies. I urge people to read them and find out what it is, just because I think Indigenous knowledges can teach us all some things that we could perhaps use but not fully appropriate, like recognise where it's come from, what the work to do, if it's relevant to what you're doing. That's kind of, but yeah, I think you're right. I think they're good anxieties, not to get too comfortable, but also there's nothing like a good footnote to say, I know this also exists, but I can't address it in this master's thesis. I call it a covering your space moment. We all have to do it.
Yeah.
You can't go everywhere, otherwise fall over. Yeah.
Good luck.
Yeah. And I don't know whether the question from the person from Puerto Rico is still here, but I've just got up on my site and I do have some, at least 5 or 7 authors talking about First Nations or Indigenous peoples from the perspective there. So just doing some, do some research and you'll find some thinkers for yourself. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
Yes.
Are we
still
all
have-
exhausted yet? I know I'm nearly getting exhausted.
Oh, okay. Would you like to have a break now, or do we still
Does
have
anybody
time?
else have anything that they would love to share or say?
Yeah, just share so that at least have some time to breathe.
Oh,
No,
I
no, no.
have been breathing. It's
Yeah,
great.
but I think what I also noticed is that doing decolonizing research, also discussing about emotional turn, on doing our research. We cannot just be like a robot, okay, I'm doing research on decolonism and I'm talking to, but we need to somewhat, it's not we need to, but then we cannot avoid that somehow we will, how do you say, like channeling some emotions through doing kind of this research, whether.
And that speaks beautifully to, aren't you good?
Okay.
The idea that we're moving away from this kind of objective science where we can, like the Kantian thing, or Immanuel Kant idea that we can, or Descartes, that we can kind of just live lives of the mind where we bracket off all of our thinking and close off our emotional embodied positioning and things like that. So yes, if it's kind of goes away again, but yeah, sure.
And then and I think maybe not for this session, maybe after this sessions, I would like to propose us to have more discussions about output of doing decolonization research, right? Because if we, used to having this articles, journals, books as one of the output of doing decolonization research, or doing research, is there a little like other, format, other way of disseminating our research? I think that would be interesting, because to now we are having more focus on how to conduct the research and what like questions, but maybe later on how to disseminate it.
Sounds good.
Hopefully. Just to keep people's, engaged after the break, because the lunch break will be like much more tougher, like painful.
That's right.
Yeah. But please, anyone, if you still have something to share, and other questions, like for example, if we discuss about Indonesia, I think when we discuss or when we do research about Indonesia, are we researching about colonized country, or we are discussing or researching about colonizer logic in some of the policies, for example? How do we position research about Indonesia? I think that's also very interesting. Yeah. You have questions? Anybody?
No, we're all,
Yeah. We're all
done.
kind of done, yeah. Okay, if it's okay, but this is to end our first sections now, and then we continue at 1 p.m. Okay. Oh, 2 p.m. Okay. Oh, yeah.
That's, that's fine. Thank you.
Okay, have a nap maybe, yeah.
Thanks for all of you who've attended from all around the place, including and elsewhere via Zoom. Thanks for attending. I hope it's lovely to have your questions. Sorry, I didn't answer most of them. Lovely to have you here.
Yeah, thanks for Liz.
Yeah.
Let's give applause to Liz for bringing us much more into active discussions, yeah, about decolonizing research. And then let's stay tuned for our next session at 2 p.m. We will discuss about how to disseminate our research about decolonizations, and perhaps another sharing of your concern. This morning we share anxieties. Maybe in the afternoon we share our hopes, hopes and aspirations on okay, decolonizing methods. Okay, thank you everyone. See you at 2 p.m. in the same room.
Okay, we can turn this.
Yeah. So how are you? Good.
Check. Oh yeah. So
Okay.
hello everyone. My name is Fabi. I'm from Department of Sociology, master program. So, motivation why I'm joining this because first of all, I'm from sociology and I learned theory. So many theory is from Western. That's make me concerned because wait a minute, why we learn all Western theory, but where is from like Asia, like Africa, like that's really make me concerned about this. But I just learned a little bit about like Spivak, like Edward Said Orientalism, and that really make me feel like I'm motivated to learn this, and I just learned a little bit from like correct me if I'm wrong. It's like Maria Lugones. If correct me, I remember Maria Lugones. I learned a little, but I forget um key concept from Maria Lugones, like and Anibal Quijano, if I correct the name. That's why I want to join this, and because this is really make motivate, and I have so many things I want to learn and gain. What is decolonization and what is important decolonization, especially especially if decolonization is connect between sociology as especially. Maybe that's it. Thank you. Gigi Alparabi, Gigi. Yeah.
Hafiz, my name is Hafiz. I am a full-time master student from Social Development and Welfare Studies. and my motivations to join to this inside forum just to wonder actually because this is kind of new methodology for me because I just recognize quantitative, qualitative, ethnography, phenomenology, such as things regarding the research methodology. So that's why I want to learn more about decolonizing methodology. And I hope that this methodology can be implemented to my upcoming thesis. Maybe because I have also a let's say redefined green jobs or like sustainability such as things. And one of my lecturers said that green jobs or like green or like sustainability or sustainable developments more refers to Western terms and sometimes marginalize maybe local communities, indigenous people in Indonesia. So that's why maybe this methodology relates with my upcoming thesis. Thank you very much.
Okay. Good afternoon. My name is Mariam Jamila. Thank you so much for this wonderful opportunity. I get to learn a lot in these discussion forums. And much like everyone else, I'm here to learn, to see how expert disseminate these. I read your profile, Miss Liz. So yeah, thank you. Yeah, Mariam Jamila. Short. Yeah.
Mbak Desi, would you like to introduce yourself? Yeah.
Hello everyone, my name is Desi. I'm the manager of the unit of research and publication faculty. We call it UP3M. I assist Mbak Vina as the Vice Dean for Research and Collaboration Affairs. And here I have my team here to come with me to prepare for the lecture. These two young people here. They are students. They try to join the unit to learn about what we have conducted every day, our activity every day. And this is Sinta. Sinta is from sociology, and this is Alex. Alex is from Department of Politics and Government, the same department from where I come from. I am actually a researcher, but now I have this duty to coordinate the unit. So these two girls here, there are also the staffs at the unit. One is Abel from sociology. She graduates from sociology, and the other is Wika, also from sociology. Yeah, and that's all. Thank you.
Okay, my name is Rifki Maulana. I think we met before like 2 years ago. I'm alumni, social policy, University of Melbourne. Yeah, yeah. I think during the end semester event, I think I think it's very interesting discussions, and I follow discussion on this morning. I think it's very interesting and engaging because I already read the book you shared before on the library as well. And during my bachelor degree in here in sociology, I also do research questioning the discourse of local Islam, try to debunking the Orientalist perspective, understanding the local expression of Islam. And yeah, I'm looking forward for engaging discussion on these sessions. And once again, I'm happy to see you again. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Muhammad Supraja. I am a lecturer here in Sociology department. I teach some of major like critical theory, sociology of education, sociology of religions, and some others. And I'm interested to attend this discussion because I think I have a concern in problem of social sciences, especially in methodological aspect, because I have a long experience teaching critical theory, especially Frankfurt School, to my student, and I have a big question about that, and of course because of I try to compare between the ideal aspect and the reality. So, and beside that, here, maybe it's long enough because my dissertation, I did my research about the relation between religion and economic. Maybe at that time I still in the crisis as human beings, as social sciences. So I have a problem to ask some fundamental question, existential question about the aspect of personality, the aspect of values, the aspect of how, like maybe Max Weber's, I think in sociology, I know that usually there are so many discourse who try to see sociology tend to observe religion as a negative factor. There are so many theoretical perspectives who try to see religion as a bad aspect in our social life because he sometimes produce violence, because sometimes religions used by some political elite to exploit the poor people to protect or maybe to gain political capital. And there are so many others negative aspects from religion who observed by especially sociologists like me and friends. Yeah. And beside that, here in Gajah Mada University, we have had an expert. He is historian and social scientist too. His name is Professor Kunto Wijoyo. He passed away several years ago. He tried to develop prophetic sciences. Yeah, I think maybe some of my friends try to say that this kind of perspective actually not so different with critical social science, like especially from Jürgen Habermas, because try to combine between moral aspect, ethic, and science. Yeah, and some of my friends say that what Kunto said is, I think, the same with, for example, Jürgen Habermas said. So there's no different, but there are so many books who have produced by Professor Kunto Wijoyo, and I think it is nice to dig about the approach in social sciences theories. That's why I want to know how maybe this small of my experience in digging social science maybe have relevancies in what will you say about the post-colonial, because as I observed that there are so many scientists, especially social scientists, try to criticize power, but at the same time, they still want to be, I think, maybe elite who don't want to be criticized by others. I think this is a problem because maybe we sometimes still in positivistic tradition, yeah, try to divide between science and norm, science and ethic. It can be separate, like in positivistic tradition. Thank you very much. I have a good chance to meet you, and I hope I can get a new experience from you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Freya. And I would also like to go. Yeah. There's something I need. I would also like to say hello to our participant who introduced himself in the chat box, Zoom. Hi, Aya May, if I pronounce your name correctly. Hi, I'm a member of staff at the University of Manchester. I'm interested in this topic and generally interested in what we do under the GHA, Global Humanity Alliance, yeah. But I'll just be listening in today, okay? I have so far enjoyed listening in the discussions. Thank you. I'm a historian of medicine and healthcare, and I'll be visiting Gajah Mada University later this month to attend a conference and meet some GSA-related stuff. Looking forward to meeting some of you there. Okay, looking forward to meeting you too. Yeah, yeah. I think. Too bad you won't be here. Yeah, but then, yeah, we'll have more opportunities. All right. Okay, so I think we have done round of introductions, and for those who are just joining our discussions today, this is our second session. In the morning session, Liz has already presented about decolonizing research, as well as how to conduct research in decolonizing while using decolonizing methods. And now in this second session, we will be more focused on 2 points actually. The first one is how to disseminate the decolonizing research. We want to perhaps let's try to open up different alternative on what is actually the output of the knowledge that we can produce or co-produce with the indigenous people, for example. And then the second point is how can we imagine, the future where decolonizing method is normalized or like is the norms.
Within the university in particular.
In particular,
what
yeah.
would that look like, even what we were talking about the self-knowledge from the Indigenous peoples that he was part of further down. So it started getting and what to do. So
Yeah,
it's a
and then-
provocation, isn't it? Like,
Yeah. And that would include discussing about the ethics.
That's
Yeah.
right.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I think for the first one, it's more like our dialogue for this afternoon. Yeah. Maybe I think Alice will share some idea just to start up our discussions, and then after that, everyone can fill in.
Starting with the video.
Yes, with the videos. So now for the how to disseminate research on decolonizing methods, yeah, Liz would like to share this video. Is it shared on the Zoom as well? Okay. Want to see the poems? Yeah. Actually, the title is Research Ethic and Indigenous People 101. And instead of writing it into article paper, as what we see, I think the message is much more, how to say, delivered, delivered, strong delivered when it's written in poems. So I think that is one example of how to disseminate knowledge using this decolonizing research. But perhaps you want to add other examples that we can also, inspired by.
The reason for actually playing it is just to really capture what we were talking about. Everything that she's critiquing to get to an understanding of decolonizing methodologies, in particular about what happens to people's bodies, voices, knowledges, the ethical dilemmas of that, and how these practices, in a sense, can speak to whatever forms of colonialism in the present that might be. So I wondered if, given some of you were here this morning, some of you weren't, but does that sort of help layer, if you like, some of the things that we were talking about this morning, actually? And would you like to comment on some of those things before we go in, maybe? Yeah?
You mean like...
just some of the passages, if you caught it or not. If you were on your phone, that's all right too. Sorry, I'm told about that's really wrong. But I was particularly struck by her again emphasising that process of decolonization. It came from enlightenment, a particular understanding of modernity, a particular understanding of certain knowledges being promulgated through, as Ramon Gross-Struvel's work was talking about, the four epistemological violences that occurred at the time of empire, imperialism, so on. So just, yeah. And I mean, really, I think you're right. The research ethics in Indigenous people says it all. Like, how are we to practice decolonial methodologies? In a sense, almost given beyond these histories, which have treated people, as the poem so clearly articulates, as data resources, as extraction possibilities, where bodies become, at a cellular level, something that scientific data collections could go in and take and do with what it wills. Now, a lot has changed from that. You talked about consent. But it's provocative to get us to start thinking about how we do your question, how we do dissemination, how we do consent, how we do ethics. Because the ethics that we might sign up to might not be the ethics that First Nations communities or communities from the global south or marginalised communities might actually believe in, their own sort of sets of values and so on. So yeah, take it away.
Okay. All right. So yeah, now we just open for, discussions. If you have sort of like, if you want to share some idea of knowledge dissemination that you think would be fit or, suitable for, as an alternative, yeah, for decolonizing research, I think that would be something we can discuss. Like, for example, if you found any other poems or poetry that might be also interesting to look at as a First Nation perspective, like what Liz has done with the song, narrative. I think that will be so interesting to look at. Yeah.
So here, what? I mean,
yeah.
What are it could be in various aspects. The poems sort of capture the impacts of oppression.
Can we listen to the song? Is it possible to have something? What's the name of, yeah, sorry, just random question. We haven't prepared for that.
I mean, I'd be interested, I mean, it might not be in English, but I'd be interested to know who your people that talk, that stick to another, what we might call counter narratives that have captured a kind of decolonial narrative before you were free of the Japanese or the Dutch. Who is it that captured the impacts on the wider people?
I know it perhaps, but not in the poem, more like novel. Like, yeah, novel, Pramudia, song, what a song about? Any
I mean, if I translate it to, and I don't want to do this, but the sort of folk traditions or the which First Nations peoples in Australia from about the 50s on really took on a sort of popular country western style of singing, and in that articulated their people's oppressions from policies, the stolen generations, being dispossessed from land, being pushed into missions, having their children taken, we said, having stolen wages, and at the same time as articulating this through writing their own songs and singing them in a popular kind of Western form, adapted that, but also managed to, in those sorts of narratives, speak for themselves, tell their own stories, their own impacts, and therefore songs and where they performed them became sites of resistance. So they could play where I might have been going to see music, but they created their own spaces as spaces away from the white policymaking, away from the governing principles of Australian politics. So they had sites of safety where they could sing these stories to each other because they couldn't get the airplay on the mainstream media, but they were still able to capture those of this of their politics. So it really interests me to think about how First Nations people sometimes are already telling the story and are already assisting the forms of both physical and cognitive control by creating their own spaces. So they're just victims and passive, they're agents, they're actively pushing against the boundaries of where they've been placed. And so recording their own. So, and I'm sure it's in information.
I'm not really sure, but maybe ganjar, like, like expressing the rudeness of the Japanese occupations in Banyuwangi. I think it's one of, in using, I think, Krong style or whatever, I don't know, but it's kind of things, the recording how Japanese aggression in that place. But I think this make me remember about one of the audience mentioned about the customary society, or we call it masyarakat adat, even though we can say indigenous community. But the thing is, the way for me personally, because once again, I used to study in Australia, I learned about that one as well, how the stolen generation and etc. But the problem is like the way we understood the concept of indigenous at some point, it's quite different. Like first thing first, like in Indonesia, every island have their own indigenous communities, and during the colonizations, the local feudals have a role as the intermediary between the colonizer, and then there's like like the local king whatever, and the community below, and not to mention also other race like the Chinese and etc. I mean, like it's not that really similar with the Australian context. That's the problem. So that's but this one thing come up in my mind right now. It's like how actually when talking about the transformative praxis of this methodology. I mean, yes, for instance, based on my experience, yes, I did research even though I cannot say it's decolonizing methods, but at the time I tried to deconstruct the Islamic categorizations, as you mentioned, when we make categorization, that's always be like universal Islam, and beyond universal is the other Islam, including the local Islam, which is I see about the local Islam called Wototelu, and they are like And interestingly, one of my findings is actually the scholars who perceive the colonial narratives, and sad to say that one of the most influential book on this study on Watutelu, actually it's really on Orientalist point of view. So my question actually, like, is it like we only end up talking in the academic levels at some point, like only in the university we're talking about decolonizing, including Australia? It's a shame that Aboriginal people don't have any representation in parliament because of the, like at the time I think it's 45 to 50% during the votes in Australia. What is the
some representation at the
Oh,
Senate
yeah.
Parliament
I'm like
level, but thinking that First Nations peoples in Australia are only 3% of the population.
yeah.
So it's always a small representation at the university. But you bring up a really good point, I think, and it's a point that we wanted to get to, which is and it's the point that Smith is also talking about in her 3 editions of the same book as a seminal text. She, as I mentioned this morning, she's really talking about decoloniality or decolonialism or decolonizing knowledge cannot simply be a theory. It has to be a set of practices. And if it doesn't become a set of practices, then it fails, or it becomes, as Tuck and Yang speak about, it becomes simply a metaphor. You can decolonize your washing rather than something that makes action and makes things change, makes change for the peoples that require this change. But it isn't something that gets acted on people, that saviour principle that we were talking about, where we know best how to act. It comes from the communities. It comes from that slow work of understanding what the communities themselves desire and what they know that they need assistance with, rather than the imposition. And I think it sort of beggars belief, really. But for example, when COVID-19 happened, the First Nations communities, particularly in so-called remote areas, they're not remote if people live there, but they're remote from Melbourne, were really reluctant to have any immunisations. And the reason why was it wasn't, and this is just crazy that it wasn't happening, but the government policy rollout had thought about rolling it out with people who spoke the specific languages, or the cultural groups representing the cultural groups, to actually hand out the immunisations. And so when a Gomeroi scholar, Nikki Moody, and others did a report for the government, the reluctance was about the fact that we have been researched so much. We have been objects of research. We don't know what you're injecting us with now. You haven't explained it. You haven't come to us. You've just come here, have little, keep you well. So people were, when they went to roll out in some communities, they weren't there. They disappeared. And so as soon as they started to get practitioners that were of the community, it becomes more real. But I was also thinking, so she doesn't, as I was saying this morning, Smith talks about the fact in some of her talks, she doesn't even like to call them research practices. She likes to call them projects. And so it's like, what are the projects that are going to have real kind of impacts with the community, designed with the community? It's questions, the communities design the questions, and then we do those sorts of things. So I could give so many examples of Indigenous peoples doing it for themselves, to cite a song, sort of. But we have had one of the first UNESCO sites, Bunjbim in Gunditjmara country in the Western Districts of Victoria, was put together by the Gunditjmara Corporation, the Indigenous peoples there, because they have the oldest aqua farms in that area where they did eel farming. That's sort of 40,000, 50,000, 60,000 years old. And they were able to show this because it was still in their landscape archive, if you like, and took it to World Heritage, and it became approved. And so a very small slice of land was already theirs because they'd been pushed off in there to a mission, had become theirs. So there are ways in which this work is already being done by and for. But there's other beautiful examples in a little community radio, and I'm sure this happens here too, but 3CR Community Radio in Melbourne, where there's a radio program with Indigenous broadcasters who every week, that's NAIDOC Week, which is a celebration of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders' life, they go into the prisons, highly incarcerated population, Indigenous peoples, because of poverty, because of colonisation, because of incarceration systems. And they broadcast from within the prisons. This to me is a decolonising practice, because when they've been doing it for 20 years, and it really, and so the Aboriginal peoples who are incarcerated in Victoria at that moment get to become people who speak to family, speak to community, move beyond the bars. The program's called Beyond the Bars. And it strikes me that there are a lot of decolonial practices that are coming from Indigenous communities that maybe we're just not that aware about. But yes, that's enough for me. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
One more question. Six may also make me wonder about, this is based on my experience once again, like during my research, I think that, am I really doing a research, or I'm just to become the voice of the community that I research? Sometimes I'm questioning how objective is research, because, we trained to be like using the Western perspective, like we need to be objective, blah, blah. Even Mas Praja also mentioned about the positive point of view that's still strong in Indonesia. Maybe in UGM, it's already like, we already talking about the decolonizing method, but in other university, especially in the local, it's very, very quantitative or positive at some point. So yeah, but based on your experience, once again, my question is like, sometimes questioning myself, like, am I really doing the scientific project, or am just become the voice of the Watutulu community? That's sometimes that's like, like it's kind of, yeah, I just questioning myself about that one. For me, research must be taken aside, especially who marginalized for ages at some point. But because of the, like there's like the hegemon. If maybe it's wrong if I say the no hegemony, like like the Western epistemology and etc. that still remains strong in Indonesia. Like like that's make me questioning: is it like objective? Is it like scientific research? But at the same time, I want to become their voice. Like because they're not only like politically, not epistemologically, they're like marginalized, something like that. So yeah, but what's your thought about this one? Like, have you ever experienced similar things? Because yeah, as young researchers, sometimes like we questioning ourselves, we questioning is it wrong or not, something like that. Yeah.
What I understand of decolonizing methodologies, I think that it's a necessity to question scientific objective data collections, because the premise of decolonizing methodologies, according to Smith and even Fanon, who wasn't necessarily doing colonizing methods per se, is precisely to put into question the objectivity of science, the objectivity that was ushered in with Enlightenment, that said all other forms of knowledges are inferior to our new sciences that the Enlightenment is bringing with it. So it's not to say that there's not good things about scientific research. I mean, I heard Linda Smith speaking about everybody thinks I'm anti-research. And it's not so much that, it's just that, is your research going to turn your research subjects into objects of your data? And the flip of that, am I becoming a voice for? Well, I don't know, because that's that thing that we were talking about this morning too, which is Gayatri Spivak's work on Can the Subaltern Speak? She was sort of talking about when white men going to stop thinking they can save brown women from brown men. Where is the voice of women in a space where they're always being spoken for and saved by others? So even that speaking position, and again, we mentioned it this morning too, the professor writer Alexis Wright speaks about who gets to speak for whom, when and where, and who listens, because many Indigenous writers, activists, scholars talk about how often they are represented by white people, or about people speaking for them, supposedly giving voice. And the problem of giving voice is that I am the person who has the power to give voice to. Right there is the problem of power and knowledge. Yep. So I think that's the sort of, it is tricky in a really exciting way, But it's also what I was talking about this morning a little bit and possibly badly, but trying to just sort of get us to think about, and I'm always thinking about this, and Linda Smith, I think, helps us think about this a lot. When is it that we should just walk away or become subterranean of sort, not necessarily reptiles under the ground, but the people who assist in the resources that we have? It might be grant funding. It might be assisting with an ethics application. It might be lots of things, but where you can mentor the voices from the Global South, or you can mentor the Indigenous person who can do the research with the community that they're perhaps from. So there's really interesting positions that give it, I mean, yes, the speaking for is quite dodgy, isn't it? And it's true, yeah. So yes. Yeah. Which is not to say that the research shouldn't be done, but it's the question that she was talking about. Do you go back to the communities and ask the communities that are going to be part of your research how they would like to participate? What is it that you would like done? What do you think you need to have answered? What do you know you want answered? And then you work from that space.
Yeah, I think it's
Sort of.
clear. Yep.
I said
More
too much.
layer of decolonizing research, yeah, not only taking side and speaking about Indigenous people, but then also another layer of how long are we going to speak about Indigenous people, and when will we give the chance or the stage for Indigenous people to speak about themselves, for example. And I think it's also important to problematize what do we mean by Indigenous peoples, or when we do First Nation communities, for example, we cannot just accept that they are all the same or have it. So we need to embrace that they are also complex with different perspective, different narrative, and then how our research can also capture, or channel these complexities. Yeah.
And we definitely tried to make that point a lot this morning, that it's
Yes.
very specific in particular regions. And if you see it kind of, it's a bit fraught, but an Indigenous map of Australia, you see it over 230 languages, which would hold different perspectives, and many people. So, who is colonised where? Is another question. So, these factors are really very, and you see with Smith, she's always talking about particularity.
Yeah.
Experience. You know, she'll talk about transnational diplomacy in relation to shared points of extrapolation of the body, the mind, but not a generalist.
Yeah.
Yes, must be.
Yes. I think very interesting. I want to explore more about the term that you have had spoken about the giving voice. There is a problem with giving voice. Yeah. For example, when in social science, we have experience about using some model social research. Its name is emancipation research, emancipatory research. I think one of the book that is famous maybe from Rajesh Tandon, yeah? Maybe you ever heard that name. Yeah, usually, we have discussed about Rajesh Tandon. He tried to explain about how to empowering, how that's still in my mind still the problem, how to empowering others, this problem. Usually we as a social scientists especially in Indonesia, we have so many social practice here. Maybe, for example, when we go to the community farm, maybe from the center, yeah, we usually practice many kind of activity like to empower economic aspect, to empower cultural aspect, and usually that activity decides maybe lecturer, maybe some activists from NGO usually done that, yeah. But the problem is still about the capital. Who gained the much capital from that interaction? Yeah, still, I think still the power, still the owner of the power. And usually, I think maybe intelligentsia or scientists or social scientists or maybe activists still have big power to that relationship. Yeah, between, for example, between activists, between social scientists and society or community members. I don't know. In this context, maybe because you know the activists have social networking, good networking with any kind of actors beside his self, yeah, beyond himself, maybe the bureaucrats, maybe politician, maybe the owner of economic firm, maybe, for example. But still, usually the poor people still have a problem with that level of empowerment, yeah. So I don't know. In that context, what is wrong? Yeah? Maybe it is wrong from the philosophy that we have in our thoughts, in especially maybe epistemological aspect, and then maybe after that we have methodological aspect, or maybe theoretical aspect, because we usually observe that finally they still who have power more is intellectual or activists, but the poor in community, as a member of community, still be the poor persons. Yeah, not much, or maybe just one or maybe two member of the community who have who could access the capital, social capital, or maybe knowledge capital, cultural capital, and so on. And maybe you can help me to observe this problem.
I'll answer it sort of sideways a bit, but and again, I'm drawing heavily on this book on decolonising methodologies. I mean, one of the things that she really asks us to sort of think with, and with that question, and the question of power knowledge nexus is, which I mentioned some of it this morning, so apologies, but is the way the concept and ideas frames our methodological approaches, and therefore brings with it a set of biases in terms of formulating the questions and the sorts of research we might do in communities that we presuppose don't have the same sorts of social capitals that you're talking about. And she's not saying that that might not be true, but she was also sort of suggesting that, particularly for her working in Maori communities, that she's saying that we often presume that some of these people, because of their impoverishment or their layers of oppression, don't know or won't understand. And so she sort of talks a lot about it's incumbent on the researcher, if you like, to share that knowledge with communities, and because it actually can help them frame, in plain language, frame the way that they can think about their own situations. But also, she often says too that some of the Maori communities that she worked with just will refuse to work with researchers or NGOs or government bodies that come in to sort of save them, if they don't come with an approach to ask the community from the get-go, what do you think you need? What are the sorts of questions that you know you have a problem with that you would like us to do the work on? So there's an empowerment that sort of subtends, if you like, or underneath the idea that we come in as the all-knowing subjects. And she says in her experience, often, if it's not approached properly, because, again, I'm going back to settler states, but First Nations communities are so over-researched, they will simply refuse to speak to you. They, you know, so it's... Yeah, so I know that doesn't answer your question, but I'm just trying to think with the idea of decolonising methodologies about what happens to that power knowledge nexus when you actually go to the communities first rather than sort of last with the funding, with the kind of, we've got this.
Yeah, and can we make some formulas, yeah, for example, for gaining maybe some criteria or maybe parameter about the output, about the process that's important. That's important to know. There's the community have in a good level, and I think maybe, for example, maybe how to make something like justice, in society daily life. For example, if we really want to empowering member of society, I think maybe the problem of justice, how we influence the situation with the justice,
Ethics, something that we can share on the screen, or something you want to read?
Well, it's interesting that you say that, because she talks about the 4 R's, which she takes from somewhere else, but in two of them are just off the top of my head: respect, and also to think about how we respond, but also creating relationships over time with these communities. And there's also a set of, like, there's our formalised ethics, the ethics application we have to do with universities when we work with so-called marginalised groups. But then she talks about ethics that come from communities. And so in a sense, in her articulation, though they exist, and they exist around a set of cultural values. And so they are the reason that you can engage with some of these communities, only if you oblige these sorts of norms as well. So in answer to your question about whether or not there can be universalized sort of formula, perhaps that's where it would fall down, because I think it's sort of almost a bit like Derrida says, in each iteration it has to be kind of a bit new, because it's a different relationship between a different group or a different set of questions. So you could have a kind of proxy form arrangement, slightly informal, that you always, I imagine, have to adjust every time you approach a new group if it's going to be more emancipatory. It's tricky. It's necessarily tricky.
I think,
and Kiye Mbembe talks about in his latest sort of work around getting away from the sort of neoliberal individualism and working. He's a Cameroonian philosopher. He works at Whit University, but talking about Africa and how Africa has always been imbued with what the West wants to think it is, rather than as a problem, as a set of problems, rather than what it could be and become. You know, what is the becoming, he asks, of Africa? It's a philosophical question. What is its being? But he's also trying to get us to think about what he calls the will to community, which is kind of to get away from the kind of individualism on steroids that we're in at the moment too, and how that breaks with a certain epistemological logics too. There's much more to that, but I was just sort of thinking about it in relation to you can kind of, well, he poses it as trying to bring in a new futurity, a new future, a new imaginary.
Mm.
It kind of ushers in something else that we maybe have yet, a bit like Derrida, have yet to think. That's sort of unthought. And so you're always working at the edges of whatever that limit is, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. And he calls it the impossible possible.
Yeah.
And I've tried to teach this to students, and it just makes all their hair go curly if it's straight or fall out otherwise. But because I think there's something really exciting in that, but it is a kind of, it's a difficult thing to sort of not knowing, you know, but you're trying to usher in something that's not the present, but it doesn't come from nowhere, but it, you know, what else can happen that can break with this system a little bit, maybe. But I got a bit.
Yeah, it's a very interesting discussions actually. But I think I also see interesting questions for us, and maybe after this, for us, for all of us here in the room, about language. Yeah, thank you, Aya, for sharing these questions. I can't really actively take part in the discussions because I'm currently on transit. But may I ask what participants think of the use of local language versus English, the imperializing global lingua franca? Oh, we have a lot to discuss about this. No. For a decolonizing research output method, well, I think it's ethical to produce research output in a local language. The academic culture and structure, like promotion, strongly encourage and values output in certain ways in English, including many global South nations. So while imperializing, English is a great tool with which to disseminate output widely because it's the lingua franca. Thanks. Thank you, Aya. I think this is one of intriguing questions. Now I would like to ask our participants in the room, what do you think about disseminating your research? Do you still prefer, English, or you think, publishing in Bahasa Indonesia is also important? What do you think? Anyone want to share? You want to share? What do you think about language? Can we start decolonizing research through publishing in non-English publisher, for example? Yeah, but sorry.
I think yes, but there's something make me worry if we using local language because not everyone know our language. Like maybe some can learn about Indonesia language, but this is really risky when you try to first English, because as we know English is a really universal language, and when we try to using local language, is it worth it, or it's have really is to using because well we want to decolonize, we using in Indonesia to maybe versus for English language, but there's something make me really worry is about it's really worth it, and some outside maybe when we didn't learn Indonesian language, it's really understanding what we want to talking about it, because because knowledge is really I think this is really difficult because language is really really one thing can start, or if you want to do something, but if we try to using other language like we using local language, actually we can use or what? That's really make me feel like okay, maybe we can, but there's something risk because not everyone maybe have a knowledge about our language. That's really it's possible, but it's really I don't know. maybe how about it? Seriously,
This is it's a dialogue, yeah. This is part of discussion. So there is no right or wrong answer. Don't worry. So yeah, in a sense, you have the idea, you have the urge or like the motivations to publish in Indonesian. It's just that the concern is that who gonna read my research? Okay. Yeah, because most readers are English. Yes, please. Hafiz.
Yes. Okay. Well, I don't want to compete between English and Indonesia as a communication tools or to disseminate our research outputs because both languages are important. When we talking about English language as a universal communication tools, of course we want to share our thoughts, our opinions, our results to the world because we know that English is a one of universal language in the world and widely used by so many like millions, maybe yeah, billions of peoples in this world. And if we want to, it depends on the goals, our aims. If we want to share our opinions widely, maybe we can use it as a communication tool to disseminate our results. However, I think Indonesian's language or maybe others local languages also important, maybe to share this is our cultures, this is our identity, this is our dignity maybe, and must know we have our own language and it's okay. I think like it's totally fine if we want to disseminate research outputs in Indian language, but of course there is a risk that not many people will understand Bahasa Indonesia as a academic language. But it's a good start to use Bahasa Indonesia globally because as I know that United Nations also recognize Bahasa Indonesia as a international language and can be used in international forums such as. So back again, I think it depends on our aims and also our goals. I also believe that besides Bahasa Indonesia, also Chinese language or Mandarin language nowadays very widely used in academic research. Of course, that's again there is a risk that not so many people understands Mandarin language. But at the first start, it's a good point to share the cultural diversity to share culture identity and also maybe to boost national pride. I guess. Thank you.
Okay, I might try to answer the question also. In my opinion, I think if we see using local language as a part of resistant effort to preserve our culture, so it is probably necessary to do that because as I mentioned earlier, I had an opportunity to observe a discussion with variety of NGOs from across the country, from across the globe also, with the UN special reports on climate change. Yeah, so with Miss Elisa Morgera also. So I downloaded the publications that the NGO submitted to the inputs on the reports. I see that there are many of them still use their own language to preserve their locality, so I think that is imperative for us to stand by what our culture is, because at the end of the day, I think that learning about or translating the cultural differences, language differences is one part of the fun of being a student or a reader. Maybe that's my opinion. Thank you.
Um, yes. Okay, thank you, Aya, for your questions. And for me, I think if I may also part of become participants of this dialogue as well. I have two stories to share about language and decolonizing research. The first story is actually this is discussions I have with my colleague about who do we write for, because sometimes it's not about writing in English or writing in Bahasa as a template, but when we write something, it's for me, I want to be a bit of like romanticizing it. It feels like we're writing letters to somebody. And then, of course, the question is, who is this somebody we want to, send our message, and or who are our audience? And then, and I think I remember one articles in Bahasa Indonesia that I found really wonderful, because it gave me a lot of reflective discussion on decolonizations. It is from our college in history department. She wrote about the marginalized vegetables during colonial periods, and it was fascinating because it's not only the people who are being colonized, even the species of vegetable are being colonized, and it's still here now. I mean, it's also come into my, sort of like concern, frustration. I feel like the vegetable that we consume now are very much same vegetable or came from tropical climates, like carrots, cabbage, potatoes, broccoli. They are not actually indigenous vegetables. And those articles discuss how the political economy process of the indigenous vegetable that being marginalized by this subtropical vegetable. Very fantastic. But unfortunately, it's in Bahasa Indonesia. Oh, sorry for English speaking. You can, but of course there is a Google Translate. But I think and I have an opportunity to talk with writers, and I was like asking, why do you write in Indonesian? Because I think it has a lot of potential contributions about decolonized research. And then, and she told me that this is about, I want to also, share this message with us, Indonesian, who speak Indonesian, that this is something that we should not forget, our indigenous vegetables. And in the paper, she has tables of list of our indigenous vegetable, and that's very fascinating. So yeah, I'll be happy to share our dialogue in English to discuss about this paper. So again, a question about language is not about which language are more powerful, actually, but it's also about delivering the message. So it's also we somewhat also think about functionalities. When I publish in English, for example, it doesn't mean that I think English is much more, powerful than Indonesian, because they have totally different logic. Like for Indonesian language, we used to have this sort of like very structured and complex sentence. While in English, I have somewhat like have to switch my mind that how to make everything straightforward, a very, I would say like very condensed statements. And that's kind of also skill set that I learned by publishing in different language. For now is Indonesian and English. And that goes to my second stories. So I also have this sort of like reflections of learning from different language, and I bring it to class. And I give my assignment to my students is that please write a monologue about power and justice, but you cannot write it in English or in Bahasa Indonesia. And then you have to write in everything else. Very interesting. So the concept, the idea of this exercise is to teach, to bring students to feel this estrangement. How do you learn something that sounds strange? So that's why we bring this assignment. And what is interesting is that on the day of our class discussion, there are around 40 local on international language there. So some people, some students bring their local language, Sundanese, Balinese, Javanese, Papuanese, etc. Also, some bring international, be taking course on French, Spanish, German language, and even some create their own language. Yes, they're linguists. They become, oh, I'm gonna create my own language. Like in the movie, like for example, the movie of let's say Lord of the Ring. Thank you. Lord of the Ring invents a lot of new language. They're Star Wars as well. So that they also create their own language. And also another even create cat language. Cat language discussing about power and justice. Very funny. I have the script of all of the language. Very interesting. But another rules we apply in our class is that now you have to present your monologue in front of your friends, and then you have a discussions. But again, you can only speak your language. Then you can imagine Balinese talking to cat language, and then the others talking. And even they invented this high school language. I don't know what's so called, like those kind of slang language in the high schools, for example. And they have to talk that no English, no Bahasa Indonesia allowed in the discussions. And that's very weird. Students found it very strange exercise, but after 10 to 15 minutes, we noticed that some students become as a translator. Because, for example, there is one student from, I think Sundanese, for example. So she found that, my friend's language from Sumatra, for example, from Padang, has somewhat similar, roots. And then she can translate it into another, students who has similar roots. I don't know how to explain it, but somewhat all of these students are speaking different language, and then somewhat it's very interesting to, this is act of learning how then we start to understand and overcome our, fear of uncertainty or fear of unknown. Yeah, because you listen to people and you don't understand what they mean, but you just have to keep listening and somewhat you are trying to, of course, I think the risk here is there is a lot of misunderstanding, I believe. A lot of mistranslation, everything. But I think, again, if we discuss about knowledge, it gave me a lot of reflections about perhaps the way we try to decolonize research is also by having a more, more space for different language in any sort of like our academic activity in class, or maybe, I don't know, perhaps in a seminar, in a conference, and let's just bring those engagement and I'm writing a paper about it, but just like very draft outline. So what I discover is that it is also about finding solidarities in translations through all of this language. So I think those two stories I will share to you and to Aya. I hope it's something that, can have more reflections about decolonizing research. Yeah.
Brilliant teaching, brilliant teaching. And because of course there's the other idea too, which is which you both articulated beautifully, that it's a practice of culture, which there's that. But there's also the fact that someone like Derrida talks about that you can speak, and I assume that you're understanding me, but you could be hearing something completely different.
Yes.
So there's always a break in the possibilities of that communication anyway. But that brings me to Linda Smith again, but also Martin Nakata's work on disciplining the savage. And he talks about, he's a Torres Strait scholar, and he talks about the possibilities of two-way learning, and that, that it might be different modes of learning, different knowledges, First Nations knowledges, our kind of more different epistemologies. But he's like, but they can come along almost incommensurably. And she talks about it as a kind of play, but there's moments where if you can be open to the differences in the way that you've articulated so beautifully in terms of teaching different languages, in the communicative forms, there can be these moments of play where there's an opening to the, if you like, the difference of the other that can remain open, but there's points of understanding and they can cross over. It doesn't mean you always understand each other, but if you're open to it, it can be really generative. And so I think about that in relation to your social capital or cultural capital too, the idea that we don't always share, a Goldex watch doesn't get translated to somebody who has no understanding of what the meaning of a big bling on the arm or the wrist is. Don't get that that's $5,000 or whatever it is. I wouldn't know. It can always fail, but there can be the opening as well. So it's that, so that's what you've been practicing and teaching. I'd like to be in your class.
Oh, why don't we teach together?
I really want to respond the interesting discussion. Yeah, I agree for some perspective, because we know that in the university, maybe especially in room, in the class, not many students or not all of teacher have same perspective, paradigm, or philosophy ideas on the reality. And the others, because we know that, as you explained before, and Suci explained, I agree. But sometimes maybe, for example, we often, for example, until now, maybe it is our limits, maybe, or maybe it is because me, for example, not so often updating my perspective, so I am late to know the new founding in science. For example, now if we have, for example, paradigm who usually understand that the reality is full of structure, and with the structure we finally maybe agree that there are so many people have different degree in knowledge, in culture, in many things. So we legalize that. And the other, for example, we know that there is another perspective. For example, if we sit it or maybe follow from Philosoph Capra, who now I think try to give no insight in the reality, because everything is connected. For example, everything is connected in the world. There is no separations in our life. So when we try to follow that paradigm, we maybe finally become rather humble to be humans, because we know everything is connected. I think there is just a little academician who try to develop this kind of ideas to social sciences approach. Yeah, I know there are so many kind of perspective that try to make the differentiation in social life between we, or maybe between us, others who have different backgrounds in economic, in social stratum, and others. So I think maybe knowing the fundamental philosophy and always upgrading our knowledge in new science is very important because maybe this condition can make us rather maybe more wise to be human beings. Yeah, and the central problem now in society maybe because of there are so many person who try to assume that he himself different with others because of maybe social stratum, because of maybe background in education. But we know that in education, we teach about science, we teach about methodology, we teach about philosophy. And we know that usually there are so many people who follow that philosophy. Usually they try to be rather arrogant, So try to make a barriers or maybe sharp barriers with others. In our society here, poor people usually wait for our humble, for our wisdom. That's why now maybe there are still many problems which we cannot solve in society because of maybe there are so many intellectual that feel that they're sit down or maybe lay down in ivory tower. Until now, this I think still the same, yeah. And if one time they become bureaucrats or maybe politicians, I think there is no changes, fundamental changes in his behavior. Yeah, maybe this I try to collect some data. So I try to go to the society, knowing about how our problem in the world of child in society. There are so many problems, and I think there are maybe there are so many solutions that give from the intellectual, not so rooted, yeah, in the problem in the daily life. So maybe understand the fundamental ideas, understand the philosophical ideas is very important because philosophy become base of our work maybe, yeah, as an intellectual. Language is finally have a good relation with consciousness. So I think there are still connects each other. So our choice in language sometimes maybe symbolize our consciousness. It is my conclusion. We need to to confront that. Thank you. Yeah.
Our discussions to the next point or the last point. It's about how to imagine, how to imagine the future of decolonizing knowledge or decolonizing method is what the sort of like the norms in university
To become a law. Yeah.
to become the
Yeah.
norms. Yeah.
And it's an interesting question too, or a point, because I would want to think with that kind of response and conclusion that which philosophy are you talking about? Especially if we're talking about decoloniality, like are we talk, because I mean, the thing that I'm trying to always learn is the sort of being open to not completely understanding the sorts of philosophies that come out of Indigenous thought, or some of the philosophies that come out of a broader global Southern literatures. I'm thinking of Escobar's work on plural versities and how important that is at a time, as you say, when we've got multiple crises coming together and kind of collision right now with climate crises that really require different ways of thinking. So I do think philosophy is important to unpack that, but I would also warn against not that you were saying this, but the sort of idea of one frame again, because what is it that is informing that, so it doesn't end up with a set of biases that sort of impact or at least inform a methodology that then once again becomes kind of universalized and overarching in its narrative making, as in the questions that we ask and the questions that we respond to. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's true.
There's much more on that, but I won't.
Yeah, but this,
but
then, yeah, and then I think it's also about, I don't know, this is something that I want to also share. To be honest, when I also try to look at, authors who are writing about decolonizing research, like Edward Said, for examples, most of these sort of like well-known global South scholars are not located in global South countries. Like Said, for example, are in the US, and it gave me like somewhat reflections. Yeah, we cannot just ignore that there is, as Mas Praja mentioned, structural difference on knowledge production in global North and in the global South. Why then, to some extent, a lot of global scholars, why to some extent that a lot of global South scholars found that it will be much more nurturing and much more enriching to do their research in the global North universities, where there is institutional support and also social capitals, academic social capitals who somewhat, growing this intellectuality, and which are not which we don't really find in the global South, to be honest. Liz, this is quite dangerous for me to say it. I have to say it. Because in here, for example, if we want to start research about decolonization research, is there any funding, government funding that can help us, for example? No.
There's the problems,
Yeah, there's problems too. Even the structure of conducting our research sometimes is that we feel we become a paper mill, that we have to, publish every year with this sort of like, pressure of performing research, teaching, social social community work, etc. And then we are in this sort of like institutional, how to say, institutional culture, which doesn't really, stimulating for global South scholars to create their own theory about global South. And that's what makes me thinking, then what are the options? Whether I should go to the global North and develop my theory there, but I have to live far away from my hometown, from the community that I want to contribute with, that I want to engage with, or I stay here and I don't know, like, and just keep moving on, for example. Then from this sort of like, I would say, sort of like, how to say this, anxieties or sort of like confusions. It makes me thinking, so what are the futures for us, especially all Global South scholars? If we want to have more literature from Global South scholars who live in the Global South, for example, what sort of like, different habits that we start, perhaps something small. Yeah. There, I'm just sharing that. I'm not sharing.
No. And I think it's ongoing. It's ongoing. Yeah. And just as one way of a response too, I think it kind of goes back to your point on language and yours too, but doesn't it? Because of course, it's a bit like what Smith and a lot of First Nations scholars are talking about in their different particularities and contexts, that there are, we've been talking for years, we've been listening for years, we've been creating knowledge for years, but no one's been listening. Or if they're listening, they're only responding from their own perspective and refusing here. They're not open to the otherness of the other or the difference that's coming through. So, yeah, and you're right, we've been really slow to respond to, and I'm very aware of the English privileging too and what that does in how you can then represent scholars. But in my own classrooms, I know, for example, when I have a scholar from the Global South or Bangladeshi author, for example, I always end up with a student coming to me after class saying, that is the first time I've ever heard myself represented since my 16 years of school. Just about makes you weep. So it is incredibly important. But again, if it's not translated, dare I say, and yet I don't agree with this, but if it's not in a form that I can have it in a reading pack as a required reading, then I can't participate in that. I might just add, not to defend the Global North either here, but we're in a sausage factory too. Like we're under the same pressures. Oh, yeah. I call it a sausage factory now. A sausage making. There might be more funding around, but by goodness, yeah. Anyway, so I digress.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, please, Evan, if you have something to discuss, but I think having this, dialogue of workshops, and it's also helpful, as for example, to have realization that perhaps the Global South problem is not particularly happens in the Global South countries, when we discuss about this, academic pressures, and somewhat we are having this debates inside the academic world itself about what do we count as knowledge, for example. So that's also very interesting to know from your experience in Melbourne and Australia. Yeah.
And I think it's a good point to make here too, that again, informed by the book we've been reading in part today, is the way we, so-called we, in the West or the Global North take up other knowledges, which doesn't reconstitute or reproduce that colonial gaze, where we just go back in and regurgitate what we want, rather than letting the voices of the otherness of the other speak and then discussing with our students, so that we're really learning other conceptual frameworks, other cultural values, other points of difference, rather than always, and it's difficult work, rather than always just kind of sucking it in extractively, the knowledge extraction, to sort of throw it out, but put it through the prism of what we already know. It's tricky work. And I don't know that I always succeed, but it's fun to get into the limits of what you know and pushing at those boundaries.
Yeah.
And so it goes back to your point too before that you were making about the sort of, I was thinking of the will to community with Mbembe's work, but also that kind of interconnectedness. I mean, this is why I think Indigenous scholars, Indigenous practitioners, Indigenous researchers have a lot to teach us as well, because they've never dislocated from that interrelatedness, that kind of, the fact that we're all related, even land, rocks, animate, inanimate, that's never kind of been severed except through the colonial imprint and impact. That believed in the mountains. Like, I don't know whether you noticed, but with Smith's opening, she talked about coming from the mountains.
Mm.
Yeah, not something I can say or I understand. When I did an interview with Yezi Mosby from Musag Island up in Torres Strait, and he spoke to the students and he said, I am of the wind and from the water. So it's that kind of placing themselves in place. They embody place. They're not, as we might say, we're on land, they're in and of land. In some ways, that's putting it into a Western component. So it's really quite different. They're already interconnected in some ways. So yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
You can say more about that if you're too.
No, it's okay. I want to give time to
sorry.
Mariam
Yeah,
first now. Yeah, Mariam.
Probably I just want to share some stories, maybe this related to the effort of decolonializing practices, in research or in practice. So you mentioned about the challenge of doing these researches. One of them is this topic is over research, and sometimes the community itself feel objectified by the thing that we do on the field. And you also mentioned about I haven't read the book. So Smith, I will read it later. So she mentioned about the real engagement that should involve the community itself, and it reminds me a person that I met recently. He was practicing colonialization of knowledge in technology. He empowered indigenous people in the jungle or within the deep land in Kalimantan, I guess, to build or to develop a drone to oversee their territory. The activity, the mining activity, the illegality that happen in the deep jungle where nobody sees or it's very out of reach. I think it's because he believed that both knowledge and technology should not be marginalized, as you also mentioned in your presentation earlier. And I think this perspective underscores the importance of respectful and empowering engagement with indigenous community rather than exploiting them or misinterpreting them for their knowledge and territories. And it's also another story that I learned from a community, a family in Kaliurang. Maybe there they have this space called Tirta Kelapa Art Space. So they utilize this space to showcase arts and more like not only painting but also sculpture, to showcase the people who are visiting or to just to collect the arts to show that they are a symbol of resistance against the mining activity that happened there. So I think it's also related to decolonization because they're trying to fight off the idea that economic growth, a threat of ecological development or such a thing. But while I had a conversation with the leaders, they said that we are quite close community towards NGOs. So they're not accepting NGOs when there are plenty of people who are trying to collaborate or to engage with them because they know they're just doing a lot of tokenism. They're just doing things to collect data. They're not trying to, I don't know, to engage with them in the fundamental level, and that is saddened me. Yeah, maybe that's my story. Thank you.
Yeah, just maybe a little. I mind maybe there are two things that's important to be underlined. Maybe first, maybe the problem of structural colonials. As Mbak Suci said, we have we face the problem of structural colonials. It is not easy for us to publish journal. It is not easy for us to do the research because of lack of facility, and maybe many of elite in this university still assume that to go to involve in one conference in abroad is for picnics. Still in the minds of some elite in campus. First, maybe a problem of a structural colonial that we have to know better. The others is a problem of colonial cultural. It has correlation with ideas, with culture, with maybe habits, and so on. And I think maybe one of my questions about in Indonesia, we have so many local community, maybe far from Yogyakarta, that have local language. But now there are so many local language become die because of there's no person in that community, member of the person in the community, dies, and there's no new generation who try to maintain that the language, the habit, and the tradition there. I think maybe it is because of the globalization. There are many young people who finally don't want to be engaged to protect, to preserve, to develop that tradition because of they understand well. It's not easy to do that. I want to know, how do you think about decolonial work? Decolonial work, and is it the same with a local genius or maybe local wisdom? I think can decolonial work or maybe is local genius is a kind of decolonial work, because there are so many local genius, local wisdom now erased by the modernity, by the modernization, industrialization, and so on. And now we maybe understand or maybe assume important to do decolonial work. So what kind of effort that we need to do? I think small question for you.
And I think this
Small question at the end of the day, you're kidding.
and that's why I think it's a suitable questions to wrap up our session.
So really briefly, I mean, no, but you're right. I mean, you're right. I mean, who am I to say you're right or you're wrong? Gosh, that sounded like, sitting up here. But what I mean is, the work of decoloniality is part of the preservation of local knowledge, and is a part of the preservation of Dr. Claire Bennett from University of Melbourne, Indigenous singer-songwriter, actually, but she does what she calls the rematriation of language. So she's saying it didn't die off. It was just asleep. It waited for somebody to come and bring it back together again. And within that, it comes back a whole lot of knowledge with it. Yeah, so I think it's both. I think it's both and. It's both decolonial work and it's coming with and from local peoples, because that's part of what she's talking about. What are the projects that we do with local communities that they require us to do work with them about that actually also preserves their knowledges? And that's not some sort of nostalgic, fanciful mode of being. It's actually real work that will make changes. And in particular, I would argue, particularly around in America, but not only America, about land back. How can we acknowledge whose land we're on? How can we bring back the knowledges that are within that landscape that is often the local people's knowledges, their specific languages and so on? So decolonial work, definitely.
Yeah. All right. Thank you very much, Liz. Let's give applause to Liz Dean.
And the one hostess with the mostess.
Yes, thank you. Wonderful participant as well. And our organizer, Mbak Desi, thank you for organizing